All right, hello everyone. So I was recently watching a video by one TJump that was about called with the title "Why Atheists Are Right: My Epistemology, the Pseudoscience of Religious Apologetics." Now, Mr. Jump and I are obviously both atheists. We happen to be right about that view, or Tom happens to be right about that view. But this video, aside from that, got an impressive amount wrong, if not everything wrong. It was a medley of confusion and just egregious error, so I thought it would be worth going through and correcting relied on confused conceptual categorizations and distinctions that do not make for good epistemology and do not make for a good way of reasoning about religion. So here is the response to TJump's video titled "Why Atheists Are Right." Okay. Give me 1 second to share the screen. Okay. All right. It's now shared.
The pseudoscience of religious apologetics. Why atheists are right.
Now, this goes to an issue that I think is sort of at the heart of a lot of confused things that are said by atheists on the subject. The problem with religious arguments is not some conceptual problem with providing arguments, with providing some phenomena that we argue is better explained by one hypothesis than another, comparing the theories in terms of their theoretical virtues, and in terms of which better accounts for facts about the world. The problem with the religious arguments is that they're false, that the things that they attempt to account for are either they rely on premises that are false, or either that, or they are not valid, or there's some other conceptual problem. But this notion that that there's this common through line that goes to show why all of the arguments are wrong is just completely misconceived in my.
Understanding the issue.
Now, Mr. Jump talks exceptionally slowly in this video, so I'm going to do it at 1.5 times speed.
The debate between atheists and theists has a long and bloody history for thousands of years, with many brilliant minds weighing in on both sides of the issue.
Okay, this is going to be a fairly irrelevant point, and doesn't go to substance at all, but there's just something frustrating about it when every time a person presents some serious work, they start with, "This work has been debated for thousands of years." I mean, whenever a person's talking about a serious topic, presumably it will have been debated for thousands of years. That's just sort of a generic introduction that people often go with that I find irritating, but
It seemed like a daunting task to wade through many tomes and multiple fields required to gain a meaningful understanding of the topic. However, this topic is a lot easier to understand than you might expect. The entire debate between atheists and theists can be understood by looking at how both worldviews describe one simple term: atheism. So what is atheism? Well, atheists define atheism as a lack of a belief in God or gods. Theists define.
Yeah, this is a falsehood from Jump. This is not how atheists define atheism. This is how some atheists define atheism. Generally, it tends to be the more academic atheists who define atheism as the belief that there are no gods, and the more popular atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens, who say that atheism is merely a lack of belief in God. There was a technical knockdown argument against the whole lack of belief definition, at least insofar as you say that you lack a belief in there being God, but you also lack a belief in there being no God. For those who are curious, look into Dutch book arguments. They can be employed against such a view. But this is a fabrication. This is not the only definition given by atheists. I go with the definition that atheism is the belief that God does not exist. And what we mean exactly by God does not exist is really probably God doesn't exist. If we thought about things properly, we would conclude that God probably doesn't exist. But atheism is not just a lack of belief, and I'm an atheist, so this is false.
Atheism as a belief that God does not exist.
What atheists say is not that there is no God. We couldn't possibly prove that. We say there's never been any evidence, there's never been a convincing philosophical argument that there is such an entity.
Right, so the quote from Bertrand Russell, Russell is just saying that he thinks that he can't prove it, but he's not saying that, this is not providing a definition of atheism. In the Dawkins definition, so again, the Dawkins definition, he says, we can't know for certain. I wouldn't deny that we can't know it for certain. But that doesn't mean that atheism is merely lack of belief. I think that atheism is the claim that God doesn't exist. And when we make a claim like, when a person says something like the Democrats are the better political party or the Republicans are the better political party, They're not making a claim with absolute certainty. They were saying, based on our best evidence and based on our best understanding of the world, the Democrats are the better political party. So that's all that has to be said, and that seems to be all that Dawkins is saying.
A number 6 at the other end is somebody who believes there's a very low probability of God existing, but still not quite 0. I'm a de facto atheist. I can't know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he isn't there.
I don't think atheism is a term we need, and it's not a name that anyone really needs to answer to.
What does it mean to you exactly? Is it somebody who's sure there's no God, or?
No. It's somebody, in the same way that somebody's sure that there's no Zeus, you can be sure that there's no God of Abraham. It's not the kind of certainty that says we have proved the absence of this thing. It's just that there's no good reason to believe in this thing.
So atheism merely being a lack of belief in God, I think, is a cop-out. An atheist really is somebody who says there is no God.
Brings up the issue of, is atheism a worldview, or is it a subsidiary of naturalism or metaphysical naturalism?
Skip some more of these quotes.
So atheism is not believing in God.
The reason these definitions are so different is because these two worldviews look at the world from two fundamentally different perspectives. The atheists look at the world from a bottom-up perspective, whereas theists look at the world from a top-down perspective.
So this is one of the places where we get into the medley of confusion that I alluded to earlier. The claims that Tom makes are just confused and rely on bizarre conceptual categorization. They're not made by people in literature who seriously consider the issues.
What do I mean by bottom-up and top-down? Well, the best way to think about these worldviews is to think of the movies The Matrix and Inception. In these movies, there are worlds within other worlds. There's only one true primogenitor world where all others descend from, and all the others are simply descendant worlds. The bottom-up worldview starts from the perspective of the world in which we exist, regardless of whether or not it's descendant or the primogenitor world. Therefore, truth and knowledge in the bottom-up worldview are always tentative and defeasible, never absolute and always open to revision. This is because if there is a world above ours, whatever we think is true or is happening here in the world we exist may not be true or may not be happening in the world above ours.
Right, so it's true that, this is not some deep distinction between top-down and bottom-up. Any conception of the world that we have will be based on some evidence that we gather, and any evidence that we gather can be revised if we adequately consider things and come to the conclusion that the balance of considerations favor a different view. And we can't have knowledge with absolute certainty, I don't think. But that does not mean that we cannot have beliefs that we're reasonably confident in.
The top-down worldview starts from the perspective of the primogenitor world from which all others descend. This means that truth and knowledge in the top-down worldview are absolute, unchanging, universal, and never open to revision. This is because no matter...
So that this is once again false. I mean, I make the claim that there's the external world. That's a top-down claim. Now, if I had sufficient evidence, that claim could be defeated. There are certain things that could cause me to doubt my belief that there's an external world. I think that I'm probably not in a simulation. However, if things turned out differently, if the evidence came in a different way, I would conclude that I probably was in a simulation. So making claims about what is true of absolute reality, that's a claim about ontology. And that's a claim about ontology that can be diffused, assuming new evidence comes in. But so TJump is confusing absolute claims about ontology, which it's not even clear that the category of absolute claims about ontology is coherent with making the claim that you're absolutely certain epistemologically about that claim, such that it can't be revised.
No matter how many worlds there may be above ours, the truth in the primogenitor world supersedes all of them and never changes. To summarize, the major differences in these worldviews is that for atheists, truth is what is apparently true about the world we observe around us, where for theologians, truth is what is absolutely true about the primogenitor world of their God.
Yeah, so this is another confusion. So truth is just that which corresponds to reality. It's not just that which appears to be true in our world. So as Trent already says, I think he was quoting Aristotle, he who says of that which is that it is, and of that which is not that it is not, speaks truth. So there's no need to appeal to some higher order distinctions about higher level truth, absolute truth. It's just truth is that which exists in reality, is that which corresponds to reality. It's just getting your ises and your is nots lined up.
This difference in the atheist and theist worldviews is what causes the difference in how they define the word atheism. Because atheists look at the world from a tentative bottom-up perspective, they define atheism as a tentative
This is a bizarre distinction. This is a distinction that's not made by other atheists. Atheists tend to say things like that. Hey, what's up, Lance? Atheists tend to say things like, we can't be very confident in any of the, we can't know these things with absolute certainty. We should always sort of revise our views, be willing to revise and update in response to evidence. Some theists don't say that. Some theists do say that. Whoops. I mean, a theist like Jonathan McClatchy, for example, would say that. A theist like Richard Swinburne, I think, would say that. So no, this is not a distinction that's made by atheists and theists, and it's certainly not the crucial distinction that explains why atheists and theists hold different views about
Belief in God and not an absolute claim that God does not exist. Because theists look at the world from an absolute perspective, they define atheism as an absolute claim God does not exist. So whose definition is correct? Well, obviously, the atheist definition is correct. In philosophy,
what's an absolute claim? Any claim, if you say that, so insofar as the claim of atheism is just that you lack a belief in God, well then when a theist says, I believe in God, and an atheist responds, I don't believe in God, or when theism and atheism are perfectly compatible positions. A person can be a theist, another person can be an atheist, and they can both be right. After all, a theist possesses a belief that God exists, and an atheist possesses a belief that God doesn't exist. So when a person says, a good definition of atheism should have William Lane Craig be disagreeing with the atheist claims. But this definition doesn't, because on this definition, William Lane Craig wouldn't think that Tom doesn't lack a belief in God. He would just say that Tom is wrong.
Also known as soft, weak, implicit, and negative atheism, atheists accurately use the term atheism to mean a lack of a belief in a God or gods. Agnosticism is a subset of soft atheism. The theist definition is also correct. In philosophy, also known as hard, strong, explicit, and positive atheism, theists accurately use the term atheism to mean a positive rejection of the existence of God. However, you must acknowledge the definition being used by the person holding the position, or you will be addressing a straw man. This also goes for us atheists. We must accept theologians' definition of faith as they define it, or we will be addressing a straw man. So how can the same word have two contradictory definitions and both be correct? Well, worldviews are like independent languages, and the same word can mean two very different things in different worldviews, just like it can in different languages. This same kind of distinction between tentative...
Well, no, words don't have radically different meanings based on the worldview. I suppose they can, but generally this is just a difference in how they define words, and the definitions will generally correspond. So in both cases, the atheist is making a claim that would sort of broadly disagree with the theist. I just think that the definition where it's just a lack of belief in God isn't what people would endorse upon reflection.
And absolute versions happens quite often in the field of philosophy, which is why they've made a way to distinguish between the soft and hard versions of various positions. In philosophy, this is the distinction between the methodological and the metaphysical versions of positions. For example, the most common being that of naturalism, which has a methodological version stating we have no way to methodologically verify the supernatural, and a metaphysical version stating there is absolutely no supernatural realm. So how does understanding this one fact help us to understand?
Now, I haven't checked Tom's sources in depth, but I know Tom frequently lies about what's in his source material, as you can see in the other video I have on my channel about my previous debate with TJump. So I would not place very much stock in his characterizations of what his sources are saying.
The entire debate between atheists and theists. Well, effectively, atheists and theists are talking in different languages. So understanding how each defines terms can effectively act as a Rosetta Stone, allowing us to understand both sides of the issue more clearly. There's a third worldview that's important to mention because it's often mixed in and conflated with the other two. This is the inward worldview focusing on things in our minds rather than the physical world or the primogenitor world. Just like whatever's going on in the physical world isn't necessarily representative of what's going on in the primogenitor world, what's going on in our minds isn't necessarily representative of what's going on in the physical world. This is the worldview of the postmodernists and the constructionists, the relativists, the interpretivists, and so on. As stated before, the best way to think about these three worldviews is as if they are independent worlds. For example, imagine if I said I'm holding an apple. There are three ways I can be holding the apple, one for each worldview. I can be holding it in my imagination.
Yes, I would say that TJump deliberately misrepresents his sources. I think that is abundantly clear if you watch the other video that is had on the channel. He repeats, no, I don't think that he just misunderstands. I mean, he has a fairly long history of lying of making false claims about what's in his sources. He, in the previous video that's on the channel, he claimed that a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page existed that did not in fact exist. When pressed, he merely said, go check on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page several times. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page not only did not exist, but there's no Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy claim that's even similar to what he was saying that exists, that substantiates a similar claim. So no, I do think that so I'm not clear if he is intentionally lying or if he just doesn't have any regard for the truth, but he's very willing to make claims frequently. Well, I mean, I don't think that he was aware that I was recording that video. Though our previous discussion, the other one that's on my channel, no worries about the deviation commission, but I mean, I think that, yeah, I think that he frequently misrepresents things. There's too long of a history of him making a series of false claims, and claims that are obviously false and egregiously false, and ones where he asserts very confidently and says, no, check my sources. And then when you do, his sources either don't exist or don't say what he says they say, for it to seem like it's not deliberate. And I think that if you look at the previous debate that we had that's on the channel, that I was recorded from a Q&A that I did, it becomes relatively clear that he's not an honest interlocutor.
I can be physically holding it in the world we perceive around us, or I can be holding it in the one true primogenitor world. This apple analogy outlines the three worldviews. The first is the conceptual, the world focusing on that which is in our minds. The second is the empirical, focusing on the physical world around us. And the third is the metaphysical.
I'm not especially knowledgeable about the specific claims that are made by postmodernism and the relativists, but it's not merely things that exist in one's mind. And when an atheist says, I'm holding an apple, they don't mean just that that based on our best, sort of most limited understanding of the world, they're holding an apple. If apples don't actually exist, then the claim I'm holding an apple is actually false. If there's no external world, if solipsism is true, let's say, then the claim that I'm holding an apple is false. I'm not actually holding an apple.
Physical, focusing on the primogenitor world. Each of these worlds is totally separate. What I'm imagining is happening in my head isn't necessarily representative of the physical world around us, which isn't necessarily representative of the true primogenitor world. Each of these worldviews is independent from one another, and what's going on in one doesn't necessarily affect what's going on in the others. Just as the worlds are independent in the world's analogy, each worldview is also independent. This is because each worldview has a different definition for truth. Therefore, something can be true in one worldview without being true in the others. Relativists define truth based on what is true in our minds. Atheists define truth based on what is apparently true about the physical world around us. And theists define truth based on what is true about the primogenitor world of their God. It's not just atheism and truth. This fundamental difference in the worldviews causes many words, terms, positions, and theories to have vastly different meanings in each worldview. Here are a few examples of such words: nothing, space, time, faith, law, skepticism, God, morality, objective and subjective, free will, who created God, why is the kettle boiling, and why did Aunt Matilda bake the cake? Understanding.
Well, I don't think that those have different meanings. They're just different. I mean, maybe some of them do, and people should make sure to be clear about their terms. But that's generally not the dispute that's being had about what those terms mean.
Into philosophy. How everything I said fits into the field of philosophy. Philosophy has two main branches of knowledge: epistemology and ontology. Epistemology has to do with how and what we know, which is evidence or tentative knowledge. Ontology has to do with the true nature of things, or absolute knowledge. The three worldviews can be categorized into these two
Yeah, no, so ontology is about what is, epistemology is about how we know things.
branches of knowledge. Here's a list of things that occupy each of the tiers of knowledge. In the
This is a bizarre. I mean, I am extremely confident that this chart was made by TJump, given that this is not a distinction that people. Well, yeah. I mean, this doesn't really track like a distinction that was made in philosophy. So generally, when we say empirical things, we're describing things that are verifiable facts about the external world. When we describe metaphysical things, we're describing things that are the fundamental basis of reality. When we describe conceptual things, we're describing things about people's minds. But there isn't like a firm divide between like empirical and metaphysical, and it doesn't relate to our level of confidence about the thing. So we can be very confident. So you don't have to have absolute certainty to make a metaphysical claim. I'm happy to make the metaphysical claim that moral realism is true, that that there is no God, and I don't claim to have absolute certainty about those. I just think that that's based on our best characterization of reality. I'm pretty confident in those, but he's conflating he's conflating how confident you have to be with the scope of the claim, which is just a bizarre conflation.
Conceptual, there's math, logic, linguistics, predicate calculus, personal experience, intuition, eyewitness testimony, anecdote, and preliminary.
Wait, math and logic are not these are not merely conceptual, right? I think that the statement that modus ponens is necessarily true. If you have a statement of the form if P then Q, Q will necessarily have to be the case. I don't think that math is just in our heads. I think we discover features of math in reality, in physics, for example. That's certainly not just in our heads.
Studies, which is the formal and social sciences, or stuff in our heads. In the empirical tier, there's methodological, tentative, feasible, observable, testable, falsifiable, verifiable, and repeatable stuff, essentially the natural and applied sciences, or stuff describing the physical world we perceive around us. In the metaphysical tier, it's the true nature of reality, absolute certainty, absolute truth, and universals, which would include such traits as eternal, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, because such traits would necessitate ontological knowledge about the true nature of reality.
Yeah, so these are not distinctions.
I put an asterisk.
I mean, he's conflating epistemology and ontology here. He's conflating the scope of the claim. Yeah, I agree with what Lance is saying. No, I mean, this is just a bizarre, I don't know. I mean, people may be sensing my degree of sort of irritation at TJump through this video, which is unsurprising. I find it just very irritating the way that TJump just, and I think lies fairly flagrantly, in much the way that Trump does. If you change the J to an R, you get a similar relationship to the truth, and it's just unwilling to walk back claims when they're corrected, which I find fairly frustrating. I mean, yeah, these are not distinctions that are made in philosophy.
Next to personal experience, intuition, eyewitness testimony, anecdote, and preliminary studies, because those are combinations of both conceptual and empirical knowledge. However, the conceptual knowledge, which includes our biases, dilute the reliability of the empirical knowledge in such examples. To quote Robert Hansen, observations vary from observer to observer with the amount of knowledge that the observers bring with them. Therefore, such examples only qualify as conceptual knowledge until we filter out our personal biases via the means of peer review, consilience, intercritical multiplism, leaving only the reliable empirical knowledge.
Okay, let's unpack this. So observations vary from observer to observer. Sure, that's true. People will observe different things. Therefore, such examples only can qualify as conceptual knowledge until we filter out our personal biases. So this is not true at all. The way that we come, so when it comes to reliable empirical knowledge, even if you could have, so it says that for it to be empirical knowledge, it has to be demonstrable over and over again. If you had 3 million testimonies of a comet, then that would count as very good evidence of the comet. And similarly, I think that there is some evidence that if every single person saw God descend from the heavens, that would be good evidence for the supernatural. Right? It would show that there is a supernatural, even though it's only observations.
Filter out our personal biases via the means of peer review.
And the second statement doesn't follow from the first one. This is a complete non sequitur. Whether or not we should accept the second one will depend on the reliability of our of observations, and whether observations that are made by lots of people tend to be reliable. But absent engaging with that question, this just doesn't. It's just a total non sequitur.
Consilience, intercritical multiplism, leaving only the reliable empirical knowledge. There are many problems and distinctions within the field of philosophy that demonstrate, like the apple analogy, that these tiers of knowledge are totally separate, because things can exist or be true in one without existing or being true in the others. Therefore, to be justified in believing something exists in any particular tier, you need evidence from that tier. Here are a list of some such distinctions.
Okay. So no, so I obviously don't have the time to go through all of them, but this is just a bizarre medley of confusion. So most of these like aren't even philosophical problems. Like positivism versus post-positivism. Well, no one's a logical positivist anymore. The problem of underdetermination, this is a problem when it comes to like scientific realism and anti-realism. Like these are just distinctions in philosophy. These are not reasons why you can't go from one to the other. Yeah. The ones on the left can't be read. The Munchausen and Agrippa's trilemma. This isn't a problem for going from conceptual to metaphysical. This is a problem with having any knowledge. And so, what it shows is that you have to have some. You either have to be a foundationalist, a coherentist. You can also be an infinitist, I think it's called. But it shows that you can't have some. You have to have some beliefs that are either circular or that are not justified in virtue of other propositions. Yeah, I mean, the problem of induction is not about empirical versus metaphysical. The problem of induction, if it were a unresolvable problem, it would mean that we can't rely on induction. This is just, it's infuriating, and he hides behind just this sort of vast array of things. They're related to pretty confusing philosophical topics, but it's just a complete conflation of what things were being talked about. Lance asks what motivated me to do this video. Well, I saw this video and I felt irritated. So, yeah. And I hadn't done a YouTube video on that, so I thought it would be worth it. Thanks, Lance. I appreciate that claim. This is great stuff.
To summarize, because the tiers of knowledge are separate, you need to have evidence of the same tier as your conclusion, or you have committed a category error and your argument will fail for the reason of at least one of the distinctions. Or to rephrase, conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence.
This is not the way that anything works. I mean, the only way that we have empirical evidence is based on conceptual evidence. So we don't have some magic detector of the world. We only have our observations of the world. And so that's how we get empirical evidence. So, yeah. I don't know. The way that we gain any knowledge of any of this will ultimately be conceptual. We'll have these claims that are in our head, and we'll analyze this. Yeah. So, okay, these quotes. So, yes, we should proportion our belief to the evidence. That's certainly true. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, and we should weight our evidence to the strength. The weight of evidence for the claim should be proportionate to the strength of the claim. But that doesn't mean that the evidence and the claim have to fall in the same array of Mr. Jump's confused categorizations between empirical, metaphysical, and conceptual.
A similar principle has been stated by many before. Hume said, in our reasonings concerning matters of fact, there are all imaginable degrees of assurance. Wise men, therefore, proportions to belief to the evidence. As Carl Sagan put it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary...
None of these claims substantiate anything that TJump is saying.
Evidence. And as Laplace put it, the weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportioned to its strangeness. Example of how this difference affects arguments. The most common example...
I think it's sort of funny how there's a 4-second delay after any new slide comes up.
Example of how this difference in definitions affects arguments comes in the form of the cosmological argument. When scientists say the universe, time, and space came from nothing, referring to the Big Bang, they are using the terms time, space, and nothing in a tentative empirical sense to mean our space, our time, and nothing we know about. However, theists interpret these statements in the absolute ontological sense of all time, all space, and absolute nothing.
This is not true, right? So there is disagreement about about whether or not particular arguments in physics get us to the claim that the universe came from nothing. But there's not a distinction about what nothing means. So the Sean Carroll quote is saying that, so I'm fairly certain that this came from the Craig debate. So what Carroll was saying was that the Big Bang is the beginning of our understanding, which is true. We don't know what came before the Big Bang. We don't have evidence that there was nothing that came before the Big Bang. But Craig is not using words differently. Craig thinks that there are arguments from the Borde-Guthun-Vilanken theorem and from philosophical arguments which show that the universe had to have had a beginning, had to have come from nothing. Now, or had to have either have come from nothing or from God. And so this is just a dispute about the substance. It's not talking past each other.
Universe, time, and space had.
Now, it's worth noting that Craig is, hey, Reginald. It's worth noting Craig is incorrect about this claim. The Borde-Guthun-Vilanken theorem shows that no classical universe. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure this is what I read this a while ago. No, the classical universe. That if the universe were described purely classically, it must have had a beginning, but it's not purely described classically.
Beginning and came from nothing, when interpreted from a scientific epistemological perspective, can be understood to mean our local universe and the time and space within it began to exist from a point when nothing of what is in our universe existed. However, what predated our universe, if anything, may have had its own time and space independent of ours, such as other universes or the multiverse. Epistemological knowledge, the bottom-up worldview, always has the implicit caveat that it only applies tentatively to the stuff we know about, and does not apply universally to all the stuff we don't know about.
What epistemological knowledge? Remember, epistemology is just the study of knowledge. So this is knowledge-y knowledge. They're just confused. And no, I mean, so I think that the claim that when I make the claim that claims about epistemology, like we're not justified in believing in God. So that claim, it's not just about the within our universe and the stuff that we know about. I'm making a claim that based on if we looked at all of the considerations, even the ones that I currently don't know about, the belief in God would not be justified based on just considerations of the things that I do know about. There's a strong inductive case, hey Danny, against there being good knowledge that justifies belief in God. There is good reason to think God does not exist, which overcomes some low risk of there being some put into arguments. So these are just confused conceptual distinctions.
We should not think of the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe. We should think it as the end of our understanding of what is happening.
The same phrase, when interpreted from an ontological perspective, can be understood to mean all time and space for absolutely everything had a beginning and came from an absolute philosophical nothing, of which no temporal thing can predate, exist before, or independently from. Ontological knowledge, the top-down worldview, is referring to the true nature of the thing, which applies to absolutely everything, including all the stuff we don't know about. Or as phrased by William Lane Craig, on the basis of the Cosmological Argument, it is therefore plausible that an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who sans the universe is beginningless, changeless.
I'll take this opportunity to do my Craig impression. On the basis of the Cosmological Argument, it is therefore plausible that an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists, who sans the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful.
Immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and an absolute conclusion. Because scientism is using epistemological tentative evidence, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful.
Okay, this is not a disagreement about the way that they're defining words. This is a disagreement about what the arguments show. So Craig thinks he has arguments against the B theory of time, thinks he has arguments against an infinite past, thinks he has arguments against the universe coming from nothing, and the universe having an impersonal creator. Now, I don't think his arguments for those work, but if they did, then the only other option would be the universe was created by some mind who had the ability to create universes. And so it's just a substantive disagreement. It's not some disagreement about what it means to have evidence. This is just confusing.
Scientism is using epistemological tentative evidence to attempt to indicate an ontological absolute conclusion, which is a category error. Apologists often say things like, the universe cannot be eternal, proven by the Big Bang and the Borde-Guthun-Vilanken theorem. They also say whatever caused the Big Bang must be timeless and spaceless, such as minds and abstract objects, and therefore conscious and personal because abstract objects cannot cause anything. These arguments.
Brenda, I don't know what document you're referring to. I'll link.
Abstract objects, and therefore conscious and personal because abstract objects cannot cause anything. These arguments are examples of religious scientism caused by the fact that apologists are misinterpreting the scientific epistemological use of the term nothing in space and time in the absolute ontological sense. The Big Bang only indicates the beginning of our space and our time, not.
Yeah, so here was the video. But just to be clear, so I agree with his criticism of the Born-Guth-Blanken theorem. Well, no, so it's the Born-Guth-Blanken theorem is a absolute claim about particular types of models. Now, that absolute claim doesn't necessarily apply to what existed sans our current space-time. But it's not just that, like, the Born-Guth-Blanken, there's no conceptual problem with a theorem like the Born-Guth-Blanken theorem applying to all time. And there are similarly philosophical arguments that I probably just think show this. Wait, I'm going to go back to this. Okay, wait, it's freezing. Here, wait, I'll try stop. Okay. Okay.
Cause the Big Bang must be timeless and spaceless, such as minds and abstract objects, and therefore conscious and personal because abstract objects cannot cause anything. These arguments are examples of religious.
This video by TJump is a couple of years old. I think it's like 4 years old.
Scientism caused by the fact that apologists are misinterpreting the scientific epistemological use of the terms nothing in space and time in the absolute ontological sense. The Big Bang only indicates the beginning of our space and our time, not all space and all time. The multiverse and cyclic universe could both have the.
Right, so I agree that this is a reasonable criticism of arguments that argue from the Big Bang to there can't have been a creation. But there are also philosophical arguments that are employed for this conclusion. So I mean, he's just responding to the weakest version of the argument, which says the Big Bang creates. There are better arguments that are made. Now, I don't think any of them work, but make employ conceptual arguments that apply
their own versions of space
for why there can't be an infinite
independent of ours, which may not have a beginning. Therefore, the origin of the universe does not need to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. It only needs to be made of something outside of our space, our time, and our material. All science, including the BGB, is tentative, and so it only applies to our known laws, principles, and particles, not absolutely everything. Therefore, the addition of new laws, principles, and particles, such as dark matter, dark energy, or quantum gravity, can result in new stable models of the past eternal universe that are immune to the Born-Guth-Blanken theorem because the BGB only applies to our current known models based on combinations of known laws, principles, and particles. The tentative empirical evidence of the Big Bang is insufficient to justify a belief in something that's absolutely timeless, spaceless, and eternal. However, the tentative evidence of the Big Bang is reasonable to justify the tentative conclusion that our universe is created by something outside of our time and our space. The Born-Guth-Blanken theorem is also tentative empirical evidence, which means it's unable to justify the claim that past eternal universes are absolutely impossible.
No, the Born-Guth-Blanken theorem is would be a problem with any. I could be wrong about this, though. I'm fairly sure I'm correct with its categorization. Any universe that's classically described, going back infinitely far. So he's wrong about this.
However, the tentative empirical evidence of the Born-Guth-Blanken theorem does justify the claim that we currently don't know how to build models of past eternal universes with our current known principles, particles, and laws in the fields of physics.
Understanding
the arguments. Even if you have evidence of the same tier as your conclusion, that isn't necessarily reasonable to justify belief in your conclusion. This is because there could be infinitely many other conclusions of the same tier. Therefore, not only do you need evidence of the same tier, but you need evidence that excludes all of the other possibilities of the same tier. The other possibilities to theism in the ontological tier are deism, pantheism, naturalistic pantheism, pandeism, acosmism, transtheism, henotheism, polytheism, an evil god, and of course, Pastafarianism. Even if you have evidence indicating something in the metaphysical or ontological tier, without evidence that distinguishes between all of these different possibilities, any of them could be better solutions than theism. Without evidence that distinguishes between them.
Okay, this is also just a really funny. He says panpsychism claims that the universe is all powerful and eternal. Panpsychism just claims that the most fundamental, that matter is conscious, that the stuff of our universe is fundamentally made of consciousness. It does not claim that that's all powerful or eternal. This is just, I mean, panpsychism is not a view about fundamental, like ultimate, it's not a view about metaphysics. It's a view about consciousness. And no, it doesn't have to be evidence for only one of them. The balance of considerations has to favor one of these if you think that you have an argument for, on the basis of the balance of considerations, favoring one of these views. But one argument can, if you had a devastating argument against naturalism, that would be evidence for theism, even if it wasn't proof of theism, even if it also could allow deism or panpsychism or the evil god.
Any possible alternatives, the only way we have to determine the better theory is Occam's razor or ontological commitment. Or in other words, the simpler theory is better. The properties of a theistic God are all-powerful, eternal, conscious, all-knowing, personal, and all-loving. The properties of a deistic God are all-powerful, eternal, and conscious.
Yeah, these are pretty amusing quotes, that arguments are not evidence and abduction is not evidence. I mean, so we employ inference to the best explanation, which is how we form knowledge in many domains. I mean, if we can't use abduction, so TJump is big on this idea of theories have to make novel, testable predictions. This is something that he said over and over again. And this is just a terrible epistemology. So, I mean, one of the things that he admitted that, I mean, he just went out and said this, as if this was an advantage to you, when really it should be a reductio, is he said that if you could use the belief that you had a round square in your pocket to make novel, testable predictions, then it would be rational to believe that you actually had a round square in your pocket. No, it wouldn't be. It would, we would need extraordinary, like some very, very good reason to believe that you had a round square in your pocket, given that it's conceptually, it's logically impossible. It violates the law of non-contradiction. What would it even mean to be a round square? And another problem is that he would just throw out most knowledge in most domains. So, like history doesn't make novel, testable predictions. A joke that a friend of mine had, I mean, whenever if a person like tells you a story about what happened in their life, that doesn't make novel, testable predictions. But that doesn't mean that we should not trust people's testimony about things that are happening in their life. Similarly, we can prefer theories over other theories based on better explaining the past data that we've already gathered. So, no, it doesn't have to make novel, testable predictions.
The properties of naturalistic pantheism, which is essentially the multiverse or cyclic universe put in the ontological context, is either all-powerful or eternal. The properties of panpsychism are all-powerful, eternal, and conscious, and the properties of an evil god are all-powerful, eternal, conscious, all-knowing, and personal. And
this is just a hilarious claim about panpsychism.
Based upon both Occam's razor and ontological commitment, some form of naturalistic pantheism is to be preferred. As a point of clarification, the multiverse and cyclic universe, as scientific theories, do not entail any absolute properties, and therefore they are not ontological in nature, they are epistemological. However, you can elevate any epistemological theory to be ontological by adding absolute properties to it, which is what I'm doing here when I claim the multiverse and cyclic universe are kinds of naturalistic pantheism. If you prefer to describe God in a different way than the traits listed on the previous slide, simply replace the traits that you prefer into the correct slots. For example,
it doesn't define epistemological knowledge. Remember, epistemology is about how we know things, so this is knowledge-y knowledge.
Espouse Professor Craig's definition of a God, simply replace all-powerful with enormously powerful, and replace eternal with timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and uncaused. Whichever traits you see best describe a God, that will not exclude other ontological possibilities, because ontological theories allow for an infinite amount of ad hoc reasoning due to their absolute nature. For example, if you wanted to argue the spaghetti monster cannot be immaterial because spaghetti is material, I can respond to the ontological absolute theory of the spaghetti monster can include the properties such as all-powerful and eternal. which go far beyond our limited knowledge, so I can claim there are many undiscovered properties of spaghetti entailed in the all-powerful nature of the spaghetti monster, such as a supernatural, non-material spaghetti soul, which is related to spaghetti in the same way apologists argue the mind and the brain are related. This same process can be used to justify any seemingly contradictory ontological theory, such as an all-good God who allows evil. The arguments.
Well, okay, so I mean, I think that the problem of evil is a devastating objection, but like it's not like a trivial like contradiction.
Cosmological argument. Premise 1, that which begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Because of the evidence of the Big Bang, cosmological arguments do indicate epistemological conclusions that are not absolute. Such conclusions that don't have absolute properties would include aliens, simulated universe programmers, the multiverse, or the cyclic universe. However, because the argument does not provide an ontological basis, it cannot be used to indicate an ontological conclusion, such as an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being. Even if the argument did indicate ontological conclusions, the origin of the universe could be explained by any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions listed earlier.
Right. So this is false. So I mean, well, so I agree that the Kalam doesn't work, but the Kalam doesn't argue. At least sophisticated version of the Kalam don't argue on the basis of the Big Bang. The Big Bang doesn't show evidence of an eternal universe. Sophisticated version of the Kalam will employ philosophical arguments for the universe being eternal. And if those arguments work, and if the B theory of time is false, and if everything which begins to end, if the first premise is true, then that would, I mean, there might be some other distinctions that I'm not attending to, but then it would prove the conclusion. I just don't think that can be established.
The evidence of the Big Bang is tentative empirical evidence, and therefore it is insufficient to justify the claim of an eternal, all-powerful cause, a metaphysical conclusion. However, the empirical tentative evidence of the Big Bang is sufficient to justify the claim that the universe has an empirical tentative cause. Now let's move on to the ontological arguments. Premise 1, God is a being that nothing greater can be imagined. Premise 2, a being that exists in reality is greater than a being that only exists as an idea. Conclusion, because God is by definition something which nothing greater can be imagined, and a God that only exists as an idea is not as great as a God who exists in reality, God therefore exists in reality. Ontological arguments commit a category error between the conceptual and ontological tier, and they fail for the reason of Agrippa's trilemma. This is because there is no basis for concluding any...
Agrippa's trilemma is a general objection to knowing things without having axioms or being a coherentist, so having your reason ultimately be circular. It doesn't just apply to going from like conceptual and ontological. And so the fact that you can have different definitions of maximally great, well, so the person who believes in Agrippa's trilemma, or sorry, the person who believes in the ontological argument is just going to make the argument that, like, the way that they have a particular definition of greatness, and from that it follows that God exists by definition. Now, based on this really simple version that TJump laid out, I wouldn't dispute any of the premises. Well, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. I would agree, perhaps, that by definition God exists. But the fact that something exists by definition doesn't mean it actually exists. You can define a real Jim, the real historical figure, as having existed by definition, given that you define him as a real historical figure. That doesn't show that he actually exists.
Any particular conception or definition of the word greatest or maximally great is any more ontologically accurate than any of the mutually exclusive ontological definitions. These alternative definitions could indicate any of the alternative ontological conclusions to theism. These alternative definitions could include definitions that disprove the existence of God, such as the claim that the greatest being is the one that can do the most with the least amount of power. Therefore, a being who created the universe without existing would be the greatest, therefore God does not exist. None of the definitions that we come up with...
That a being who doesn't exist would be who creates things while not existing would be logically impossible. This is the greatest possible being. So no.
...within our mind about what is the greatest or the maximally great qualifies to justify belief in a metaphysical conclusion. Let's move on to the teleological arguments.
Then how would we come to any beliefs about what's metaphysical? If we can't use the evidence from the things in our mind. I mean, TJump's a moral realist, so he thinks that we can use the things that are in our minds to come to beliefs about what exists metaphysically in reality. namely objective morality.
Premise 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is either due to chance, physical necessity, or design. The fine-tuning is the fact that a universe conducive to life occurring has a probability of 1 in x, some very large number, because if the physical constants were changed, life could not occur. Premise 2. The fine-tuning is not due to chance or physical necessity. Conclusion, therefore, the fine-tuning is due to design. The biggest problem of this argument is the fact that it claims that something is improbable, therefore it must be designed. The improbability of complexity in life being 1 in x tells us nothing, because even though that 1 in x may be the least likely outcome, it could also be equally as likely as all the other outcomes, or even the most likely outcome.
What this is just so one, I mean, TJump was talking about this as if his epistemology was some great way of distinguishing between truth and falsity, and what he did here was he just provided a incorrect objection to the cosmological argument. Now, notice he didn't object to any of the premises. So, no, what he just said is that just because it's unlikely doesn't mean that that it couldn't have happened. Well, it means that it's unlikely that it happened by chance. And so some fact about the world is evidence for A over B if it's more likely if A is true than if B is true. And so if the probability of the universe as we know it were high on the hypothesis that God exists and near zero on the hypothesis of chance, and we could rule out necessity, then it would be true that was extraordinarily strong evidence for a God. Now, I don't think that I don't think that this argument works, but there you have to engage with the actual argument. There isn't some deep conceptual problem with like these types of deductive arguments.
Life and complexity being the least likely outcome is kind of like a coin with a width of 1x landed on its edge, which is essentially the apologist's argument that it's so improbable it must have been designed. Life having an equally likely chance of occurring as all other possibilities would be kind of like a dice with x sides landing on any side. This would be analogous to the argument by Victor Stanger, who claimed that even though changing one
Sure, but if a die had Google sides, and so let's say that there was a 10% chance of the die being rigged, and the die had Google sides, and you know that if it were rigged, you would get 1, and then you roll the die, and it comes out to be a 1. Well, that would be a really strong evidence that the die was rigged, because on the hypothesis that it was rigged, you would expect to get 1. You do get 1. And on the hypothesis that it's random, you would expect to probably not get 1. And so it just depends on what the other hypotheses are and what our credence is in the different hypotheses.
Result in a non-life-limiting universe. Changing multiple congruent constants may result in infinitely many possible life-limiting combinations of constants.
Stanger doesn't say
the most likely or even a necessary outcome would be kind of like a dice with 2x sides and 2 sides.
But I agree with
landing on
Stanger's
sides that have been filed together. This would be analogous to Steven Weinberg's argument that constants may be interconnected, and changing any one may result in a proportional change to the others, like in the case of the weak and the electromagnetic force, which we now know are the same force. Without an understanding of the environment and the underlying mechanisms causing the apparent fine-tuning, we cannot rule out chance or necessity, as both of which have a basis in physics where design does not. Also, apologists' current attempts to definition of design fail to be ontological because they only incorporate known empirical forms of life complexity and not all possible ontological forms of life complexity.
Well, no, so this is not true. So, it'll depend on our assumptions in physics. But people like Luke Barnes argue that that you just couldn't have any atoms or any particles that form in most possible universes. So if that turns out to be true, if it turns out that you can't have atoms in most possible universes, well then you can't have any type of life absent there being some particles.
Because metaphysical or ontological claims require metaphysical evidence, and apologists are only using empirical examples in their definition of design, that definition can only indicate empirical designers that lack absolute properties, such as aliens or simulated universe programmers. Moreover, apologist definition cannot be used to indicate an ontological designer, such as an all-powerful God. Even if life complexity could indicate non-ontological conclusions, when compared to the ontological possibilities of life complexity, which may include non-physical life, our empirical definitions of life complexity may be indicative of any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions listed earlier. The empirical evidence of the
I agree that the fine-tuning argument doesn't prove anything about what the designer has to be like. But why is the statements about the desire, why are those ontological, but statements that there was a designer empirical?
apparent fine-tuning of the constants is insufficient to justify belief about any claims about a metaphysical conclusion. However, the empirical evidence of the apparent fine-tuning of the universe is sufficient to justify empirical conclusions such as those proposed by Victor Stenger or Steven Weinberg. Let's move on to the moral argument. Premise 1. Without God, there is no objective basis for morality. Premise 2. Morality is objective. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Moral arguments commit a category error between the conceptual and ontological tiers, and they fail for the reason of Agrippa's dilemma, the problem of the criterion, and the problem of the universals. Essentially, what this means is that we have no basis to conclude there is a such thing as an objective morality, and even if there was, any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions listed earlier could be the basis of that objective morality. For example, naturalists of pantheism, which is the multiverse or systemic universe, can claim to have a basis in objective morality in a super law, simply one we haven't discovered yet. The fact that we all experience morality is conceptual evidence, and therefore does not justify
morality being a law of the universe or something contingent seems to go against what we mean by morality. Morality has to be true in all possible worlds for it to be morality, for it to be an objective morality. But again, Agrippa's trilemma. So I'm not familiar with the problem of the criterion, but so I won't comment on it. But I'm familiar with many of the problems that TJump is raising, and these are just general problems about knowing things in philosophy. They're not specific to jumping from like conceptual to empirical to metaphysical.
I believe in a metaphysical conclusion of objective morality. However, the conceptual evidence of the morality we all experience is sufficient to justify belief in a subjective morality. Let's move on to the historicity of the Bible and the resurrection of Jesus. Historical claims, which are a form of testimony, are by definition conceptual, and therefore because empirical claims require empirical evidence, historical claims cannot be used to justify belief of the events empirically occurring, rather than just being a product of someone's imagination based purely on conceptual evidence of historical testimony. If I told you I saw a real living breathing unicorn, you should not believe me. However, if I told you I saw a real living breathing dog, then you should believe me. This is because even though I have not...
Okay, what if we had 500,000 records from ancient tribes that said that they saw unicorns? I mean, unicorns are just horses with horns. I would believe it if we had 500,000 distinct written accounts about seeing unicorns.
Provided any explicit empirical evidence for either the dog or the unicorn, we have implicit empirical evidence for dogs, and therefore I do not need to provide an explicit empirical basis for the claim to be reasonable to accept.
But we have empirical evidence that there are dogs. We have no empirical evidence that you saw a dog. So a better way of thinking about this is just in Bayesian terms. The probability of you seeing a unicorn, our prior is pretty low, so we would need strong evidence. Our prior in seeing a dog is much higher. So, or if you said you saw a dog, we would think that you probably had seen a dog, but it's not about some conceptual distinction between tiers of evidence. It's just about the strength of the evidence required to show different types of claims.
Based on testimony. Unicorns do not have implicit empirical evidence, therefore they would require explicit empirical evidence.
What is an implicit empirical basis? What is different between implicit and explicit empirical basis?
Before they are reasonable to believe from testimony. Historical claims work the same way. If claims already have an implicit empirical basis, then they are prima facie reasonable to accept. If they do not have an implicit empirical basis, then an explicit basis must be provided before they would be reasonable to accept. Therefore, miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the supernatural, paranormal, aliens, and similar would all need an explicit empirical basis before they are reasonable to accept based on historical testimony or conceptual evidence.
Okay, so let's imagine we had 500,000 sightings of Bigfoot that were all totally consistent, that spanned across time. Or imagine if aliens came down to us, like appeared, killed a bunch of people, and then like, and then went back up. Would those aliens not be evidence? Would we have no evidence for aliens because it's only an implicit empirical, because we lack an implicit empirical basis? No, you don't have to have something be repeatedly demonstrable. You just need like the strength of the claim has to correspond to the strength of the evidence. And so if our prior in something is very low, then if there's weak evidence, then we won't update to believe in that. Yeah, Synth, I agree with you.
However, it is reasonable to believe such claims to be delusions or misconceptions, as those are conceptual conclusions and therefore only require conceptual evidence, such as historical testimony that lacks an empirical basis. The fact that we have
no, but also no. So he's conflating. So when we say conceptual evidence, so earlier he was talking about conceptual evidence as just what goes on in a person's head, but we can't verify what goes on in a person's head. So now he's saying conceptual evidence is a person's testimony about what goes on in their head. But we shouldn't necessarily believe a person's testimony about what goes on in their head. There are, false allegations of things. And so we should consider all of the factors in determining whether or not someone is accurately reporting what goes on in their head. We shouldn't just believe it. It's something that goes, because it's a claim that they make about what's going on in their head.
Historical claims, which only qualify as conceptual evidence, is insufficient to justify the belief that the events empirically occurred in the physical world around us. However, the conceptual evidence of historical claims are reasonable to justify belief in delusions or misconceptions, as those are also conceptual conclusions. A common rebuttal to this principle is that if it is true, all history is unreliable. This is false, because this principle only applies to things that lack an empirical basis. Therefore, all historical claims about things we already know are empirically possible are prima facie reasonable to accept. Historians have additional criteria to judge historical claims, therefore something simply being empirically possible does not necessarily make it reasonable to accept, which is why I say it's only prima facie reasonable. A similar argument was presented by Hume and Hitchens. As Hume stated it, there is not to be found in all history reason.
Wait, okay, let's back up. So we have an empirical basis for like Julius Caesar having existed, we don't, right? We have particular documents that are about Julius Caesar. We have this explanatory role that's played by Julius Caesar, but what is an implicit empirical basis? We have an implicit empirical basis that there are people, but we don't have an implicit empirical basis for for Julius Caesar in particular. We just have documents. Whoops. Sorry about that.
Does not necessarily make it reasonable to accept, which is why I say it's only prima facie reasonable. A similar argument was presented by Hume and Hitchens. As Hume stated it, there is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves. As Hitchens phrased it, what is more likely, the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you have made a mistake? Neither Hitchens nor Hume were strong.
But there is an amount of evidence that could convince us of a miracle. It's just a very large amount of evidence. If we had 5 million testimonies of something that we thought to be a miracle, if we had 5 million, if we had every person who was around at the time from all over the world attest to the resurrection of Jesus, then it would be reasonable to believe in the resurrection of Jesus.
So what do the historians have to say? The Christian historian, Michael Licona, in his paper Historians and Miracle Claims, says, most biblical scholars and historians hold that the investigation of miracle reports lie outside of the rights of the historian acting within their professional capacity. This definition is espoused by R.G. Collingwood, Geoffrey Elton, J.H. Hexter, and Maurice.
He then disputes that view.
By Robert Webb. In the same paper, Licona quotes Robert Webb's justification for this position. Definitional limitation. What is usually understood to constitute history is not making an ontological statement about the totality of reality. Those whose worldview includes a supernatural realm and the possibility of theistic causation may respond in two different ways. They may define the breadth of history to include the possibility of divine causation, or they may view this understanding to be a definitional limitation of the modern discipline of history and how it functions without it being an ontological statement about the nature of reality. This latter view I could call methodological naturalistic history. In other words, for the purposes of doing historical work, the historian is methodologically limited to causation within the physical space-time universe. But this does not limit the historian's personal ontological worldview, just his or her historical method as a historian. In conclusion, there are 3 types of knowledge: conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. Claims in one tier require evidence of the same tier. Apologists are making metaphysical claims without providing any metaphysical evidence, therefore their claims are unsupported, and any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical conclusions are equally or more plausible than theism. As far as I know, there is no metaphysical basis of knowledge with possible exception of solipsism, math, and logic, which could all be explained by any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical conclusions to theism. Therefore, either we can accept methodological naturalism, science, as the highly exclusive
what?
evidence of the same tier. Apologists are making metaphysical claims without providing any metaphysical evidence, therefore their claims are unsupported, and any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical conclusions are equally or more plausible than theism.
But TJump believes in moral realism. TJump believes some metaphysical claims. He believes, for example, that ought implies can. I'm pretty sure. That's a metaphysical claim. The claims that he is making about, he makes a claim that God probably doesn't exist. That's a metaphysical claim. Unless you define metaphysical claims as claims which one has absolute certainty in, But then that's
there's
just
no
about
method-
our degree of confidence, and it has nothing to do with the scope of the confidence.
basis of knowledge with possible exception of solipsism, math, and logic, which could all be explained by
Wait, he says of solipsism, math, and logic. We have evidence for solipsism, math, and what? What is he saying?
any of the mutually exclusive metaphysical conclusions to theism. Therefore, either we can accept methodological naturalism, science, as the highest form of knowledge that we have, or we can extrapolate to an ontological conclusion, in which case theism is no more supported than any of the mutually exclusive ontological conclusions, including the spaghetti monster.
Rounded it out with the spaghetti monster. Okay. Let's see. That video, okay, that was sufficiently fun, but maybe I'll let's see. Should I stream another TJump video? What do you all think? I don't know. I've been sort of rage watching some TJump videos. Because I don't know. I mean, it is sort of entertaining, but he's just so confused about things and so confident in his confusion and delusion. Okay, you know what? Let's stream the Doherty debate, I think. Let's do that. No, I mean, but I just don't have anything to add beyond what Doherty was saying in that debate. Okay, let's stream the Emerson Green debate, okay? Dumpster fire, TJump versus Emerson Green. I mean, it's a funny title. This one's not too long. Yeah, okay. Okay. Full disclosure, Emerson Green is a friend of mine. So yeah. Disclosing any potential conflicts of interest.
Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley.
Yeah, this is. Yeah, no, he did really get crushed in this discussion with Bernardo Castro. That was pretty brutal. Bernardo Castro. See, I'm not an idealist, but I find Bernardo Castro to be pretty impressive. He's clearly very smart and has really thought about the issue in a great detail of depth, in a great degree of detail. I like.
TJump and Emerson Green, thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yep.
You can find Emerson Green's content all over the place. It's a podcast named Counter Apologetics. He also has a sub-podcast through that called Walden Pod. That's on many outlets, but also on YouTube. And then a YouTube channel that you would highly benefit from looking at is TJump. He debates a ton of people. Would it be mostly on apologetics, TJump?
Probably, yeah. Moving into politics, there's also some flat earth and conspiracy theory stuff on there, but mostly professors and apologists on reasons to believe in God and stuff like that, morality, epistemology.
So today we're talking about panpsychism. I was hoping you guys could define that first, because I'm one of those people I think that misunderstands it, and I think a lot of the listeners might not know what it is exactly or have concepts about it that are false or maybe conflating other ideas with it. And also it would be good to hear your definition of it, because it's very easy to just start talking past one another if we're really arguing two separate things. I think all three of us find that whenever we talk about morality and we're talking to an apologist or something, and you spend half an hour arguing back and forth and realize, no, that's not the definition I was using. So Emerson, if you don't mind starting us off with your definition of panpsychism, and then Tom, if you don't mind following up thereafter, and then I'm just going to try to stay out of you guys' way.
Sure. So panpsychism is the view that experience is fundamental and ubiquitous throughout the natural world. So experience is just sort of a fundamental feature of matter. Like if you were already working under the assumptions of physicalism, it actually isn't that much of a step away from physicalism. You just take physicalism and you say that the intrinsic nature of physical matter is experiential rather than some concretely existing non-experiential thing. So it's not that much of a leap, but it happens to solve all these like conceptual problems that physicalism has, which is why I go for it.
Cool. So essentially you'd say it's kind of like you're adding a fundamental property to electrons. So it's kind of like how they have spin, charm, all the different properties of electrons. You're adding in conscious experience.
Charm? Yes, electrons are very charming. Wait, I'm pretty sure he said charm.
That physicalism has, which is why I go for it.
Cool. So essentially you would say it's kind of like you're adding a fundamental property to electrons. So it's kind of like how they have spin, charm, all the different
electrons have charm. There's charming electrons.
Properties of electrons. You're adding in conscious experience to one as like one of those fundamental properties of matter.
No, that's a common misconception, because people are working usually with this like Cartesian conception of matter, where they basically agree with Descartes, even though they're not dualists, which is that matter has a certain nature. But what I'm sort of doing is saying that what we think of as matter is sort of what consciousness looks like from the outside. So the intrinsic nature of matter is experience, and then those physical properties that we always talk about, that's sort of like what matter does or how it behaves or its structure. But yeah, what the thing actually is. So like we already sort of have an example of this with ourselves, I would say. Like, you know, from the inside, you're a conscious creature. You know, that's what you are at your core. And from the outside, you look like a brain.
I sometimes doubt that TJump is a conscious creature.
You know, if I study your consciousness, what I'm actually going to find is, you know, electrochemical brain activity. And but what you actually are, you know, intrinsically is a conscious creature. So panpsychism.
There was a different video where Emerson Green used the term electrochemical brain events, and people got objected to that as being like too jargon laden. So and Emerson was like, wait, so what should I call it? Brain doings? So I think that he was being jargon here. Should have said brain doings instead.
It's just kind of think that, you know, that sort of dual aspect character of the brain just kind of pervades the world, in part just because, you know, you're made of the same stuff as everything else in the world.
So you're saying consciousness is more like an elemental force, kind of like wood or fire or water, kind of like how those Platonic objects, they thought there were the different forces that exist in the world, and the world is made of these kinds of things. And you're saying consciousness is just one of those things. It's like one of the fundamental things.
TJump is deeply confused about what Platonism says.
The universe that everything is made out of.
Yeah, I guess so. It's like Sir Arthur Eddington said that the stuff of the world is mind stuff. And, you know, I guess I kind of go along with that, where consciousness is sort of the only concretely existing stuff, and what we call matter is a representation of consciousness, like Schopenhauer thought. Like there's what the thing is in itself, which is consciousness, and then there's the representation of the thing in itself, which is matter. So it's like an ontological monism and sort of an epistemological dualism.
Okay, so everything around me is made of consciousness. This cardboard box is made of consciousness. This lighter is made of consciousness. This knife is made of consciousness. They're all made of consciousness. That's about right?
Yeah, and you might get the wrong idea from that and like think that they're all like subjects of consciousness, but I'm really just saying they're made of the same, you know, natural stuff that you're made out of, just arranged differently.
Right, and you're saying that stuff is consciousness.
Yeah, basically.
So why? Because it doesn't seem like there's any reason to conclude any of these have any aspect of consciousness whatsoever, that there's any analogous part. It seems like it's the other way around. So like if I said all roses are flowers, but not all flowers are roses, you would be like you are seeming to be saying that all flowers are roses.
Oh shit! Panpsychism, BTFO. Panpsychism correctly notes that some matter is conscious, but that doesn't mean that all matter is conscious. Devastating. For the record, I don't have very strong views about panpsychism. I think it
seems much more reasonable.
I think it's somewhat plausible, though I'm not a big, hardcore panpsychist. I lean away from physicalism about consciousness, but I don't have and I lean away from epiphenomenalism, but between some type of like interactionist dualism versus some type of panpsychism, I don't have very strong views.
I think that consciousness is a product of matter and not the other way around.
Well, you know, that's, you know, where I started off just, you know, being a materialist, thinking that consciousness is produced by matter. And the wording is actually kind of tricky there. I think a lot of people who call themselves materialists are actually like property dualists or something. But the reason that I think that consciousness is not an emergent property of matter is because I don't think that materialism or emergentism can really do a good job of explaining why we have phenomenal consciousness in the first place, which I can go through. But the thing is, like, phenomenal consciousness really needs an explanation. The fact that it's
let's start there. You said materialism can't give an adequate explanation of something. That seems like an argument from incredulity or argument from ignorance fallacy, one of those two, where it says, this theory can't explain it.
What? This is not... God. TJump just doesn't... So we have a couple of different views. One of the views is panpsychism. One of the views is dualism. One of the views is physicalism. So Emerson Green is saying that TJump's view is wrong and can't explain the data. That's not... are there any... Okay, wait, or I'll answer that in a second. But so arguing against one of the three views does serve as evidence, especially if it's the view that the other guy is espousing. So his point is that physicalism can't account for it. We have to either go with some type of dualism or some type of panpsychism. But dualism is false, so we have to go with some type of panpsychism. That's a perfectly, like, that argument is fine. It's not an argument from personal incredulity. It's not saying we don't know how consciousness works, therefore my theory. Okay, Lance asks, are there any... Yeah, we're both atheists. And we're both utilitarians. And we're both hedonists about well-being. And we're both anti-realists about all non-utilitarian views about objective morality. We both agree that all non-utilitarian views of objective morality are incorrect. Lance just disbelieves in one more view of objective morality than I do.
Mine can, therefore my theory.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, if that's what I was arguing, you'd be 100% correct. But I'm saying that materialism is inadequate because it can't explain phenomenal consciousness, which I have some arguments for. And those arguments seem to naturally lead to panpsychism once you actually...
Lance wonders if there's a common source. Well, the positions of yours that are correct those are the same as the position of yours that correspond with my views.
Go through them.
Okay, so there's these arguments that materialism doesn't answer, panpsychism does answer, therefore panpsychism.
Yeah, panpsychism is a better explanation of phenomenal consciousness than materialism.
So it seems like an argument from ignorance or argument from incredulity. You're saying that here's some arguments, materialism can't answer the argument, panpsychism can answer the argument, therefore panpsychism.
Well, we're trying to explain the data here, and panpsychism can explain the data of consciousness, materialism can. So,
no,
yeah, that's a good argument.
That's a perfectly kosher argument. If you say, like, okay, so let's imagine that, so sort of three views. Well, you also have idealism. But so if you have some argument and you say, so if you're just arguing between two different views, materialism and panpsychism, then if you argue materialism is false, and then if the scope of the topic is narrowed down to materialism and panpsychism, then arguments against I keep thinking imperialism. No, materialism are perfectly kosher arguments in that they make. And so, yeah, I mean, well, there are other options. You don't have to dispel with all the other options. We can just sort of compare the theories broadly and see which one does best. Wait, Lance, you're like a Dennett guy, right? About consciousness. You're a zombie.
Well, it's okay magical being pixie leprechauns, but that doesn't mean magical green pixie leprechauns are a good explanation. The fact that you can make up an explanation of something doesn't mean it's actually better than anything else. So,
but magical pixie leprechauns are not a good explanation. They do incredibly poorly in terms of theoretical virtues and in terms of explaining the data. And they already have to be consciousness. So you're presupposing what you're trying to explain. Well, Lance goes further than Dennett. Lance is just a zombie. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we have a zombie in our midst.
The fact that you can explain consciousness one way doesn't mean that that is correct or any evidence to conclude that you're right. It's just a made-up explanation until you have some way to...
No, it is evidence that you're right. X is evidence for Y if Y is more probable in virtue of X than prior to learning about X. So if you rule out materialism, then that's evidence for all of the views that are not materialism. It's not definitive proof, but it is some evidence. I'm not familiar with Pete Mandelick's positions, but yeah. If you go further than Dennett, then I suspect that you're a zombie. I was chatting with Detroyer recently, and I gave Detroyer the zombie diagnostic test, where I asked him a series of questions and to diagnose him as a philosophical zombie. And I think he might be a zombie. He was at significant risk of being a zombie based on the diagnostic test. Zombies on average score 12, and he scored 8. So he's at serious risk of being a zombie. But I suspect that you would score solidly into the zombie range.
Independently verify that made-up explanation outside of your imagination, then it's not evidence of anything.
Right. Well, I'm not using magic. It's I got to this.
Well, just to clarify, that was an alternative hypothesis that can also explain it. That is a reductio ad absurdum. So it's like saying if you.
But it's not a good hypothesis. It does extraordinarily poorly in terms of theoretical virtue.
If you want to take the argument.
Oh, Lance, I was just asking a series of questions. One of the questions. Sorry about that. Okay, one of the questions that I asked was like, when you read Dennett, do you find yourself being persuaded? Another one was like, do you find yourself confused when you hear other people talk about qualia? There are a couple of other questions for that zombie diagnostic test.
That materialism can't explain X, but I can make up something else that can explain X, and therefore that made-up thing is a better supported explanation. Well, then I can do the same thing, and instead of going with consciousness, I can go with magical green pixie leprechauns. So the point here is that if that methodology is correct, then we can use it to lead to any ridiculous nonsense we want. And so that entire methodology is not evidence of anything.
I mean, the methodology I'm using is just analytic philosophy and trying to come up with the best explanation of the evidence. My point is that materialism can't explain the evidence, so materialism is ruled out. We have this other hypothesis that does a good job of explaining the evidence, and I mean, that's why it's the same way you end up at any other position.
Well, no, so that's not the same way anyone in science ends up with any position. That's why idealism is rejected by 90-something% of neurologists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, every scientific field. It's just not...
TJump has no evidence for this claim, by the way. Also, Emerson is not an idealist. He's a panpsychist.
Seriously, exactly because that's not how scientists come to conclusions. Anybody can make up an explanation to explain anything. It's super easy, infinitely many ways to do it. The difficulty is showing that explanation actually corresponds to something in reality independent of your explanation. So just saying that X can't explain Y, I can make up something else that can explain Y. That's not evidence of Y.
Well, we compare the theories in terms of their virtues.
That's evidence of nothing. So that isn't particularly constructive to say that, well, materialism can't explain, I can. That's like saying, well, science can't explain the Big Bang, God can, therefore God. It's a terrible argument.
Yeah, so, I mean, let me try to see how you come to believe things, since apparently, like, you're saying that, like, considering evidence and coming up with good explanations of the evidence is not how we arrive at
no, I didn't say that at all. So, no, evidence is not arguments. Arguments aren't evidence. So those don't count as evidence. Arguments are conceptions.
Arguments are evidence. Why? We have good reason to think that you can't have true contradictions based on the arguments against true contradictions. We have good, I mean, like in philosophy, we don't have empirical evidence for things generally.
So in order to be evidence, you have to show evidence is that which can differentiate imagination from reality. So for it to count as evidence, you need to take those arguments as a form of abductive reasoning.
That's not what evidence is. X is evidence for Y if X is more strongly predicted on the hypothesis of Y than on the hypothesis of not Y.
Try an inference to the best explanation, which does not count as evidence. And then you need some independent way to verify that it actually corresponds to reality independent of your imagination. Just coming up with arguments isn't evidence. So I'm not saying that we don't look at evidence. We definitely do. What you have isn't evidence. What you have is your imagination.
So the way I'm using the word evidence, it's the same as the word data. So it's like what I'm talking about are factors extrinsic to a hypothesis that raise or lower our credence in that hypothesis. So consciousness or phenomenal consciousness is, data extrinsic to our hypotheses, materialism on the one hand, and panpsychism on the other.
Well, sure, but that's
saying that materialism doesn't do a good job of explaining this data.
Again, that's still an argument from ignorance or argument from incredulity. It doesn't make a difference what materialism does or doesn't do. It doesn't add or take away any credence to your hypothesis whatsoever. So that isn't in any way evidence to reference materialism at all. You would have to show that yours actually has some evidence. And the data doesn't count as evidence. That's, again, abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning is a form of affirming the consequent fallacy introduced by Charles S. Peirce to logic. You're not allowed to just look at the data.
Abductive reasoning is not a fallacy. Abductive reasoning is, so when we have some hypothesis and we want to explain it, we'll try to come up with the best explanation. That's all that abductive reasoning is. It's not logically fallacious. This is just a hilarious line that shows that TJump found this on Reddit or something, and then just went with it.
Post hoc come up with an explanation and then insert the explanation as more likely to be true than another one. Hypotheses don't work that way. Well, I mean, hypotheses do, but you have to take the hypothesis and then show some way that it's true independent of your imagination for it to count as something more than a hypothesis, which you haven't done. So your hypothesis of consciousness being fundamental is no more supported than the hypothesis of magical pixie leprechauns being fundamental.
Well, it is because I have arguments for it and because it's a better explanation of the data, which you can reject that way of approaching things, but it's universally accepted by scientists and philosophers. It's not really problematic.
No, again, so I already debunked that. So again, the consensus in every academic field is idealism is wrong. So they do
TJump's already debunked it, guys.
not use your methodology. They say your methodology is completely wrong. They do.
No, they don't disagree with his methodology. They disagree about whether the boundless considerations favors abandoning idealism. They don't, now I'm saying idealism. I mean panpsychism, because that's what's being argued about. TJump refers to panpsychism as idealism over and over again in a way that's bizarre. But no, they don't disagree with fucking abductive reasoning. They disagree about whether abductive reasoning favors panpsychism or whether it favors other things.
Assess evidence, they do assess conclusions. What you're describing is how you assess hypotheses, which no one cares about until you can verify those hypotheses independently, which is explicitly stated by the reference I just gave, Charles S. Peirce, on affirming the consequent, which is abduction, also post hoc theorization. There's entire class.
Okay, let's Google this, okay? Charles S. Peirce, affirming the consequent. Okay. Charles S. Peirce is a largely forgotten American original thinker. It's interesting concept. Okay. Let's see. Affirming So if the syllogism so sure, right. So like, the way that Harman does it, where it's just an infinite the best explanation, is perfectly kosher. I'm not very familiar with Charles S. Peirce and what he did, but yeah, I mean, we don't just throw out like abductive reasoning. This is so ludicrous.
Classes of fields in philosophy and science that address this explicitly and say, we don't care about your hypotheses until you can independently verify it. So no.
Okay, so hang on. Let's talk about independent verification, because the thing we're talking about right now is a little different from normal scientific or philosophical issues. So phenomenal consciousness has this weird property that it's unobservable. We know it's 100% real, obviously. I hope you'd agree with that. But consciousness is real, but it's not observable. So it's
Lance, would you agree with that? That consciousness is 100% real?
You can't really verify hypotheses that involve, hypotheses about consciousness.
This is question 1 of Lance's consciousness diagnostic test. Okay.
Sure you can.
Because it's not observable, so you can't.
It doesn't need to be. In science, there's this thing called indirect observation. We can't directly observe the Big Bang, but we can observe the consequences of the Big Bang. We can say, if the Big Bang happened, then we can predict there's going to be this thing called the cosmic microwave background. We predict this, we then build a big telescope to look for it. We find that's good evidence of the Big Bang, even though we can't observe the Big Bang. Same with evolution and all kinds of things we have indirect evidence for. So we can observe, there are testable predictions which can have been confirmed about consciousness, which is namely that it's material. We make the predictions that if consciousness is material, then we can mess with consciousness by doing certain things in the brain, very precise predictions that have been confirmed with very high levels of accuracy. So that does confirm, just like it confirms the Big Bang, that the brain and mind are synonymous.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. So the whole thing about affirming the consequent. So, like, if P then Q, if P then Q, Q therefore P, that would be invalid. But if you say if P then Q, Q therefore P, it becomes more probable. That's perfectly kosher.
That's why 90-something% of neurologists, cognitive scientists, psychologists are all materialists.
Right.
This is TJump doesn't say the sources. I don't think there have been polls of them about materialism.
So
is
that is a prediction.
And a very significant chunk of philosophers are not material.
Of monism, actually, and panpsychism is a form of monism. What you just said is
no, those are predictions.
Interesting. Yes, they are. You said the brain and the mind. You said the brain and the mind are the same thing.
No, you're not getting it. So it's not. I get to tell you what my theory is, and then I get to make predictions based off that theory. So I can make a theory that there is a round square in my pocket, and if I can make successful testable predictions, that is evidence of a round square. It doesn't make a difference.
I mean, it would be evidence, perhaps, but it would not be good evidence. Right. Abduction is not deductive. Congrats for realizing that. Right. But when I said congrats for realizing that, I wasn't talking about you, Philip. I was talking about TJ. But, yeah. No, I mean, it would not be reasonable to believe you have a round square in your pocket merely because you use it to make 2 correct predictions.
What the actual entailments of the prediction are. So it's like saying, I could predict that the sun will rise tomorrow. Now, obviously, that doesn't entail the sun exists because we could be in the matrix. But we do count that as evidence the sun exists because the evidence is predicated on a theory that the sun is real. So because the theory entails, I believe the sun is real, therefore it will...
No, this is not the way that evidence works. The way that we establish evidence doesn't relate to who was around at the time making claims about whether or not, about what things would happen. We take... things that are, Newtonian mechanics is a good higher level heuristic, but it's not, it doesn't work down to the, fundamental level. There are slight inaccuracies, but the stuff that we don't have more evidence for Newtonian mechanics than for theories that postdated. Some theories that postdated are able to come up with better explanations of things that Newtonian mechanics was able to explain.
Rise tomorrow. If it does, that's evidence the sun is real and that we're not in the matrix. Even though it doesn't entail that. So it's called fallibilism. You don't need the entire theory.
We don't gain evidence for the sun, for us not being in the matrix, based on people saying that the sun will rise tomorrow and then the sun rising tomorrow.
be entailed by the prediction for it to be evidence of the theory.
Okay, hang on. It is also a prediction. Let me put it this way. It is also a prediction of panpsychism that if you mess with the brain, you would mess with the human mind.
For it to be a prediction, you have to predict it as in before we do the experiment. So you have to say, given my hypothesis, here is a testable prediction. Publish a paper demonstrating that testable prediction to come true, which I haven't seen any idealist ever do.
Well, look, the hypothesis of panpsychism and the
idealists have never published papers making scientific claims. This guy clearly just doesn't know Bernardo Castro at all, because he has used it to make testable predictions that he claims have come true.
Hypothesis of materialism. These are both metaphysical hypotheses. So they both make the same prediction with regards to if we change the brain, we will change the human mind.
Whoa. So again, prediction is you have to be before. You guys give post-predictions. You say, well, there's the evidence all the materialists discovered, and we can explain that too. Anybody can do that. That's exactly what the theists do when they say, oh, look, scientists discovered that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. We can explain that too because God did it, not evidence. The fact the evidence is consistent with multiple hypotheses does not mean it's evidence for multiple hypotheses.
Right, so whether or not post-diction is permissible will depend on how. So if you post-dict some evidence, then that will undermine the probability that that evidence is strongly predicted by your hypothesis. But if your hypothesis is a very simple, straightforward one, that doesn't have any malleability, that doesn't leave any room for subjectivity, then post-diction is just as strong of evidence as prediction. I mean, one of the things favoring string theory is that it's able to explain gravity, even though we already knew about gravity. You get post-diction. That is a thing because we want to explain the data. It doesn't matter whether the data was gathered before or after some theory came around. I don't know why TJump thinks this, or where he's getting it from, or what the argument is for this bizarre view in epistemology.
Hypotheses. For it to be a prediction, you need to make the diction before we know it and then confirm it. And you haven't done that. Materialists have done that. So even if you can post-diction it and say, well, we can explain the same data. Well, it's not evidence for your hypothesis, but it is evidence for the materialist hypothesis because they predicted it. They discovered it before we knew it, whereas you guys didn't. You just post-dicted it.
Well, panpsychism has been around for...
Okay, let's imagine that we have two theories, okay? One of the theories is discovered after we gather all of the data, okay? And the other theory is discovered before we gather the data and makes predictions. Those two theories make the exact same predictions. One of them does way better in terms of theoretical virtues. The other one does way worse in terms of theoretical virtues. They posit exactly the same physical laws. One of them just posits that it's reducible to some more fundamental physical law that explains the other physical law. However, the simpler one was discovered later. So it was discovered after the data came about. Would we believe the first one just because it came first before we gathered the data? No, that's obviously idiotic. And if we did that, then we would throw out all history, because history doesn't make novel testable predictions.
For a long time. And well, it's not like you're saying that we just came up to the scene and then started post-dicting. But
just to clarify, so Hinduism has been around for a long time, but Hinduism didn't make predictions about DNA. Science did. So the time frame in which it came about is irrelevant. What matters is can you make novel testable predictions and get them right? And then that would be evidence of your hypothesis. But I've never seen
this whole issue with making novel testable predictions. I mean, we have to come back to the issue of unobservability. So yes, it's true that science deals with unobservables all the time, but this is a little different.
Yeah. So I mean, the problem for Emerson here is that Emerson just doesn't appreciate how idiotic TJump is being. TJump's isn't saying that materialism and panpsychism make different physical predictions. What he is saying is that even if they make the same physical predictions, materialism wins because it came first, and most of the people who were doing the tests were materialists, which is an insane view. But Emerson attacks the more reasonable view rather than the ridiculous one that TJump actually espouses.
From the normal case of science dealing with unobservables like the Big Bang or electrons or something, because those things are postulated to explain data. And this is not, consciousness is not being postulated to explain data. It is the thing that we're trying to explain. It's not like we knew the Big Bang was a thing. We say, how do we explain this? We had data. We say, how do we explain this? We come up with the Big Bang. It works the other way around.
There's no difference there. It doesn't make a difference. If you have a phenomenon, like you see fossils in the ground, you say, what explains this? Well, evolution does. Then you make other predictions that you don't know yet. And if you can confirm those, then that's confirmation of your hypothesis that you made up to explain the data. It makes no difference whether...
one of the reasons why one of the pieces of evidence for evolution was that it was able to explain lots of data.
you come up with.
I mean, by the reason why serious people reject string theory is based on it being a bad explanation of things. It's not based on like the fact that it can't make like novel testable predictions.
The hypothesis to explain the data, or the data is a prediction of the hypothesis after the fact. It's irrelevant which one comes first, as long as you then make other novel testable predictions. So if you say, here's the data, consciousness, and if consciousness is produced by the brain, then we can zap your brain and make changes to your consciousness, and we confirm that. That's evidence that consciousness is material.
So that hypothesis, first of all, it does make a difference whether the phenomenon itself is unobservable or whether we're postulating unobservables to explain phenomena. Those are two different things. But second of all, the thing that you're describing is not really materialism. It's just the general hypothesis that the brain is the mind. And in case you don't
No, that's incorrect. That's incorrect. So
panpsychists also believe that
yes, I understand what panpsychists mean. So I tried to explain this to you before. I get to tell you what my hypothesis is, and any evidence, any predictions I make are confirming of my hypothesis, whatever it is. So if I say the world is material and I make a testable prediction and it gets right, and that's evidence the world's material. It does not matter if it can fit into your hypothesis. It makes no difference at all. My theory could be anything. It could be I have a round square, like a logical contradiction in my pocket. If that is my theory.
Okay, by this standard, if the materialists thought that they had round squares in their pocket, then we should believe in round square materials.
And I make a prediction, a novel testable prediction that is correct, that's evidence of my hypothesis. So it makes no difference what my hypothesis is. I get to tell you what it is. And then if I make testable predictions and you don't, then my hypothesis has evidence and yours doesn't. So if a materialist makes a prediction based on materialism, that's evidence of materialism and not evidence of dualism, regardless of what the prediction is.
Okay, what was their prediction specifically that they made? Their whole thing that they were testing was the brain and the mind. Like that's the hypothesis that they were testing.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that basic thesis is a part of many theories of consciousness. It's not just part of materialism.
Yes, that's true. Just like the Big Bang is a part of many theories of theism, also not evidence of theism. So again, the fact that you can post hoc explain the data isn't evidence of your hypothesis.
It's not post hoc. I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, this is not.
Well, no.
You keep bringing up
who made the predictions? Who did the research? Who wrote the papers?
The Big Bang is evidence for theism, specifically if the type of theism involves positing that there is a Big Bang. And the Big Bang, if true, which of course it is evidence for any theory that predicts that involves the Big Bang, and it's evidence against any theory that involves the falsity of the Big Bang.
It was all materialists. Materialists are the ones doing all the work in neurology. They're the ones making 90% of like neuroscientists are neurologists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, all materialists. There's a interview from Seth Andrews and Julian Mussolino, specifically talking about the consensus in this field. Like no one's an idealist, no one thinks there's this consciousness stuff there. No, the consensus is that that's wrong. Everyone in the field doing the work, making the predictions are materialists.
Yeah. So again, the data of neuroscience. First of all, scientists are not philosophers. They're often not very good philosophers, and this is a philosophical issue. This is not a scientific issue. Like the data of neuroscience are compatible with different views, and I can also appeal to authorities here and point out that two of the greatest neuroscientists alive right now are panpsychists. Like two of the leading,
what you can't actually
neuroscientific theories of consciousness are global workspace theory and integrated information theory. Integrated information theory implies panpsychism.
So the consensus overrides all anecdotes of particular authority. So the consensus wins, and the consensus is overwhelmingly.
This is not expert consensus. This is consensus of what neuroscientists think about philosophy of mind. They're not philosophers of mind.
No, the philosophy of mind is garbage. It has nothing to do with reality. It's just imaginary.
That's what we've been talking about this whole time.
No, I've been talking about reality and physics, neuroscience, the actual fields that are actual authorities on this.
So
not
have I.
philosophers of
You
mind.
just haven't really been.
Philosophy of mind is garbage. You heard it here first.
Philosophers of mind are also majority physicalists too, by the way. But even so, philosophers of mind are not the relevant experts in this field. Neurologists are.
Again, this is a metaphysical issue. This is not a neuroscientific issue. Neuroscience is just dealing with different questions than the ones that we're talking about.
Nope, that's incorrect. So in order to get to metaphysics or ontology about what reality consists of, you need some way to show that your ideas are conformed to reality and aren't just in your head. So that's why I mentioned at the beginning, evidence is that which can differentiate imagination from reality. Philosophers of mind can't differentiate a thing. They're just a bunch of imaginary ideas that never go beyond being imaginary, which is why they aren't relevant experts. You need someone who can do that. And the ones who can do that are the neurologists.
I was thinking this might be a good part where I could chime in and try to offer something here that I could be wrong, but like we finally got to that part where you might be talking past each other. I was afraid it would be in the definition, but you guys seem to agree primarily there. But Emerson seems to be looking at this from a philosophical point of view, while Tom seems to be looking at this from more of a scientific point of view. And Tom is saying, I need some evidence for this, or some kind of predictive power for me to accept it scientifically. And Emerson's saying, well, this is a philosophical argument. But at the same time, in philosophy, we still have ways to present the argument that you might refer to as evidence. So, I mean, it would still have a if this, then that, or a number of other ways of trying to prove your point. Do you have something like that, Emerson, that you would say this would be a sufficient philosophical argument?
Well, I don't actually want to go there just yet. So first, I want to bring up the point, because in epistemology, the whole point of what evidence is that which can differentiate imagination from reality, because we can all make up different hypotheses. And until you can provide a methodology that can accurately differentiate which ones are real and which ones are imaginary, then you have no evidence at all, none. So just presenting arguments doesn't count as evidence unless you can show that the methodology you're using to come up with those arguments can differentiate imagination from reality, and that's where he would need to start before he presents any arguments.
How would now I feel like I'm debating you, but just in terms of making a philosophical argument, I don't know how we would I don't know what's a good example. Argue deontology versus utilitarianism or virtue ethics. You know what I mean? Like in that moment, you are trying to argue your best form of ethics. But if it was just in philosophy and not in science, which by the way, I agree with you, Tom, and I disagree with Emerson, but in a philosophical, I don't know how, if I was trying to make that argument, I could meet your standard.
Well, no, the thing is, you can't. There's nothing you can do. It's not going to ever be as credible as any kind of materialism. Materialism wins by default, and then this is just a fun hypothesis we like to take. Think is interesting, but it'll never be as serious as materialism. That would be the admission you would need to make in order to move forward, unless you could provide some way to make it as serious as materialism. So the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that materialism is the serious position. It's the only academic serious position. Idealism isn't. It's not even taken seriously because of this criteria.
So he's not an idealist. Yeah, no, I mean, TJump just doesn't know about epistemology. Doesn't know about epistemology, doesn't know about ontology, doesn't know about psychology, doesn't know about sociology, doesn't know about physics, what's physical.
Criteria
knows about no domain.
Can't provide a way to differentiate imagination from reality. Materialism can. It works very well with this, and that's why it's not taken seriously in any academic field.
I agree 100% with all that.
After you admit that, then we can go into the fun philosophical arguments that I can show either equally as explainable under materialism or better explained under materialism. But the first thing that you need to show is that this idealism isn't the one taken seriously in academia. It's not the serious philosophical or scientific position. Materialism is. It's the one that's actually supported because it actually has this extra thing that can differentiate imagination from reality. It provides that, whereas idealism doesn't provide that, and that's why materialism has a significant advantage.
I see your point. So, like, if I was gonna argue.
God, the mod is infuriating. The mod like thinks that they're both like being reasonable, when TJump's just being like brain dead and Emerson's being reasonable.
Argue that Aristotle had it right all along, right? And then you say, well, you have to show that that's not just in your mind, that's not imagination, that's the virtue ethics is a reality. And I said, well, I don't know how I can meet that goal. We're having a philosophical conversation. And then you say, well, first you have to say that it doesn't exist, and then we can talk about it as a philosophical possibility. I would actually at that point concede and say, I don't know if it does or not, but here's my theory, or here's Aristotle's theory. Let's address it conceptually. I would think that would be a fair
or
argument.
ethics, where there's no better alternative hypothesis that actually does have supported evidence, that would be perfectly fine. But in the case of consciousness, there is a better alternative hypothesis with tons of supporting evidence, and that's why it's not fine.
Would both of you agree that this could be discussed at least?
Okay, so let's imagine, right, that there had been like a medley of like 4 virtue ethicists who have been like, if virtue ethics is right, we predict slavery will go away in a few hundred years. Would that mean that just virtue ethics wins by default? No! Of course not.
Conceptually.
Sure.
Do you have
obviously
a conceptual argument that would defend panpsychism?
Yeah, well, I said at the outset, materialism can't explain why phenomenal consciousness exists, and it's the most certainly known natural phenomenon, so that's kind of a problem. But the issue, I think, between me and Tom is that Tom imagines himself to be on the side of science, and I'm on the side of philosophy, and it's just, we're both doing philosophy, it's just one of us doesn't realize it.
Well, no, I'm on the side of philosophy, too. Everyone is against you in every academic field.
That's not true. But also, I don't care.
Bill Survey's paper, like physics polls, like everyone in every academic field says idealism is wrong. It's like a 2 to 5% max in any academic field of all of the surveys in every field.
Why do you keep saying idealism?
Well, just the idea that consciousness is fundamental and grouping panpsychism and idealism. But so that would be incorrect. Technically, you're panpsychist, but idealism is more understood term. So
it is slightly different. I mean, actually, it's a lot different. But
right. But the point is that idealism is a much more common view than panpsychism. Panpsychism is an even more minority view than idealism. And so if I group them together, then if I group them together, it's still in single-digit percentages.
I don't think that that's true. I think there are more panpsychists than idealists.
So then if I want to just talk about panpsychism, where it's in like a several dozen people category, that's even less significant. So the point here is that view is a minority in every academic field. It's not taken seriously exactly for the reason I just expressed. You can't differentiate imagination from reality.
I don't think it's
every view about consciousness is a minority. Type A materialism is a minority, as type B, as is type C. And then type D dualism and type E dualism and type F like panpsychism and such. They're all minority views, but that doesn't mean that none of them are true.
Seriously. Well, no. I'm saying, first of all, it's not as much of a minority position as you're making it sound. It's not a dozen people. And it's also like, it's got a long history with pretty well-known thinkers. The problem that I see with what you're saying with just appealing to quote-unquote expert consensus, which is I don't think an accurate way of characterizing what you're doing here, is that we could just go back into a different time, pretty recent history, and the opposite would have been true. I mean, these things are basically just academic fads. That like idealism was once
we can
fashion, materialism was once in fashion.
We could go back in time where people were more ignorant than they are today, didn't have the same information they had today, yes. And then they would possibly be justified when they had less information to come to a different conclusion, sure.
Okay. Well, these are, I mean, I feel like I'm just repeating myself, but we just don't see eye to eye on like philosophy of science or like what philosophy is or what science is. Like the things that were about like prediction and post-diction and that sort of thing. Like I think that you have.
Well, I just gave straight up definitions from the Stanford Encyclopedia on all of those. So if you disagree with those, that's kind of a problem. Post-hoc theorization, you Google it. Claude Shannon, abduction reasoning, that's literally the thing. I gave you the references on these because I'm reading them right now.
Okay. So do you want to move on to the conceptual arguments?
Sure, I think you've questioned enough on that one.
I think you just don't understand what you're doing. I feel like you just don't know. I mean,
yeah, again, I gave you all the references, so you can check everything I just said to show them right. Feel free.
It's just the points that you're choosing to argue on are just like, they're not points that I've ever had to argue before because they're just universally understood among philosophers. And it's just like.
Again, I gave you all the references to prove I'm right. You can literally check them one by one.
Okay. Okay. So do you want to talk about why you're a physicalist?
Why? Because all the evidence indicates physicalism.
Oh, okay. I hadn't realized that. Okay. But you said that you want, I believe you said novel testable predictions.
I said a way to differentiate imagination from reality. The way I use is novel testable predictions. If you have a different way, that'd be great.
Okay, so other than these predictions that the mind and the human brain, the human mind and the human brain are basically the same thing. Is there anything else other than that makes you a physicalist?
What? I mean, like all the predictions in every academic field related to neurology, cognitive science.
Why are you a physicalist? What has convinced you that physicalism is true?
It's the only theory that makes novel testable predictions, and it's made all of them.
What are those novel testable predictions?
Everything from geology to cosmology to physics to neuroscience, everything in science is based on novel testable predictions, like the entire field of science.
Geology? What are you talking about?
I'm a physicalist, not just for the reason of just the mind. I'm a physicalist because everything in every field, every testable prediction, not just related to the mind, but related to everything in the world, is predicated on the theory of this is physics.
Yeah. All right. Those of us who are not physicalists, pack it up. The evidence from geology is in, and the bunts materials.
Physical stuff, and it works. So every single field, like physics and cosmology and geology.
Now, for the record, so I'm thinking of debating TJump about philosophy of mind, and his ludicrous epistemology, and morality. But he demands $50 to debate him, and I don't want to spend $50, especially because I tend to give my discretionary funds to effective altruist organizations. And so, I would rather not, I would rather not have a couple of extra kids get malaria so I can debate TJump. But if you want to contribute to the fight against TJump, you can go over to my Patreon page, which is the link to it is in the about page on YouTube. It's also just patreon.com/deliberation under ideal conditions. If I can raise $50, then I'll debate TJump about, then I'll pay the $50. So if you all are interested, then you can donate. Now, instead of doing that, you should donate to effective altruist organizations. But if you're not going to do that, you may as well donate to my Patreon if you want to see that debate happen.
Biology and biology, they all make testable predictions that are all confirmed, all based on the idea of physicalism and materialism, and they work. And then we can then infer that to the mind and say, well, the mind, same pattern in neurology. All the testable predictions are made by physicalists. All of them are predicated on the mind and the brain are the same. They all work. It's the only one that works. So that's why I'm a physicalist. So all of the evidence in every field.
Okay, well, we're talking about philosophy of mind, and I'm saying I'm a physicalist in the same very broad sense that you just defined the term. I mean, I don't know. Again, it just feels like you don't know the words that you're using.
Physicalism is the idea that the mind is the brain and that they're all just physical processes. And that's it.
Exactly,
So what I did was I said that I am a physicalist in that I think the mind is the brain, not only because of the work.
Can you all see the link that's sent? I know YouTube is sometimes weird with sending links.
In neurology, but also because of every other field, we've only ever discovered material things. They're the only ones that make testable predictions. Like if idealism could make other kinds of testable predictions in other fields and those would work, then it would be reasonable to infer that maybe the mind is this other kind of stuff that makes predictions in these other fields. It doesn't ever do that. The only thing that ever works in any field is the physicalist, materialist position, and so it's reasonable to infer that it applies to every field because it's the only one that works in any field.
Okay, so in your mind, how would the science of geology change if panpsychism were true?
That would be up to you. You would have to say
it wouldn't change. It wouldn't change.
Okay, so you have no evidence.
You have to make predictions that would change fucking geology.
I'm glad you have no evidence, but if you had I'm a panpsychist and I'm going to make a prediction that no one knows yet based on my theory of panpsychism, then
two theories can make identical predictions. And so if you have philosophical arguments for one of the theories that makes identical predictions is wrong, then, and assuming that they make identical predictions, then all the predictions of the other one would be evidence for the first one. Dumbass.
That would be evidence of panpsychism.
Okay, but again, just the sciences that you're making reference to do not really establish physicalism in the way that you seem to think.
I've already addressed this. So physicalism is established. If I make any testable prediction we don't know yet and it's right, it establishes physicalism. It doesn't make a difference if you can explain it or not. So it doesn't need to falsify idealism to be evidence of physicalism. It's not how
I'm not saying it needs to do that. I just, there's some kind of disconnect here over how science works or how philosophy works. I can't quite put my finger on where it is exactly. But I mean, like,
so science and philosophy work on novel testable predictions as a method to differentiate imagination from reality. That's how it works.
No, they don't. What novel testable predictions are made in philosophy? Here, let's just go down the line of the Phil paper survey, okay? I'm getting very heated about this. TJump just like infuriatingly idiotic. Okay. A priori knowledge. Oh yes, new scientific test discovers a priori. Here, I'll screen share. Okay. Yeah. Yes. New study confirms abstract objects. Recently, scientists ran an experiment and detected abstract objects. None of these make novel testable predictions. Oh yes, Newcomb's problem. 2 boxing makes correct novel testable prediction. New scientific test proves that zombies are impossible.
That is literally how it works. We say, I have an idea, a hypothesis, then we need some independent way of verification, and that independent way of verification, when it's confirmed, is evidence of the hypothesis. That's literally how it works. This is literally what it says in the definition of abductive reasoning presented by Claude Shannon.
This is how like the like 4th grade version of the scientific method works. Where like, first you come up with a hypothesis, and you test the hypothesis. This is not how we do philosophy.
Which is affirming the consequent, and why?
Because philosophy is the things that we can't do straightforward tests on.
The hypothesis methodology you're using fails and is rejected by the consensus in every field.
Yes, Philip Muller, you are spot on. No, he gets everything wrong, and then he's incredibly... Okay. And then he's incredibly confident that he got everything right. It's infuriating.
Yeah, you're misrepresenting the consensus. You're misrepresenting how philosophers...
It's like Ray Comfort. But if Ray Comfort was like more arrogant.
Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Phil Surveys paper, a poll of recent attitudes in physics. I'm not misrepresenting. I just gave you the sources that literally prove they're correct. You can't just say I'm misrepresenting anything when I literally give you the sources that prove I'm correct.
Okay. I mean, I don't feel like we're getting anywhere here. This is not like a normal conversation about, like, I talk to physicalists all the time, and this is not like the normal conversation that I have with physicalists. Like,
that's nice.
This is not.
Is it possible?
Like, I don't mean to.
Emerson and Tom, is it possible that you guys are talking about both science on one end and philosophy on the other end?
No.
And attempting to conflate the two?
No, I'm covering both. So I know exactly what he's saying. I know exactly why it's wrong. And I've explained it like 4 times now. And he says, oh, you don't understand science. You're misrepresenting science. When I literally provide the sources, I'm reading the science. So this is the problem that idealists make, is that they think that...
Ah, yes, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is science. He is reading.
They don't understand epistemology. They straight up just don't understand the closure principle or Nozick's, I forget what Nozick's principle is on the same topic. They think that because you can explain the data in multiple ways, that the evidence of your hypothesis, it's not how evidence works.
Yeah, it's not what I'm saying.
Okay, what are you saying?
I've explained it like 4 times, and you're still not
your argument from ignorance.
It's not an argument from ignorance. You're using these like logical fallacies from like YouTube videos or something, and acting like that's how.
Okay, you literally said materialism cannot explain it. My hypothesis can. Therefore, my hypothesis. That's literally what you said. Those are your words.
That's not what I mean. Like I have arguments against materialism that work as arguments for panpsychism. We did not even get into those because you're many different issues.
So these arguments are essentially, here is something that your hypothesis can't explain that mine can. That's what the argument is. That's what an argument is. It's saying, here is something that your hypothesis can't explain that mine can. On its own, it's nothing but an argument from ignorance. So saying that
when we have a hypothesis and it can't explain some of the data, we revise the hypothesis or come up with a new one that can. That's the ordinary progression, and that's what I did.
No, that's the ordinary progression of coming up with the hypothesis. Then you need to independently verify it, which is the part that you can't do. So making up an explanation.
Consciousness is unobservable. It makes no sense.
So saying that you can't provide evidence for your hypothesis is just admitting
you can't provide evidence for yours. The fact that you think that you provided evidence, you have not provided evidence for materialism. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. You've provided things that are evidence.
The fact that people with your view make novel testable predictions. If the theory is equally well explainable in some other way, then it's not evidence for your theory over the other theory.
Evidence for materialism and are equally evidence for other points of view. And
that's the fallacy that the idealists always make that is completely wrong. That's what I mentioned before, the closure principle and Nozick's whatever principle. That's literally what it's addressing.
Yes, I heard you the first few times. What I'm saying is that
is wrong. That is demonstrably wrong.
The thing that you're pointing to as a prediction is not more expected on materialism than it is on other.
No, that's the exact fallacy that I keep bringing up. That isn't how evidence works.
It's fucking Bayesian reasoning.
No. That's not how Bayesian reasoning works either. Bayesian reasoning also works against idealism because it's also never worked. So the whole point here is that methodology that is the foundation of all idealism is that, just because it's a prediction, it can be explained on multiple multiple hypotheses doesn't make it actual evidence for multiple hypotheses.
You think that's the reason people are idealists? Again, I'm not an idealist, but
reason
you're like, that's the
people are
reason
idealists?
for all idealism. That's not the reason for all idealism. The point is, like, these different views are empirically equivalent, and it's really hard to distinguish between them. So we have to go to these conceptual distinctions because, like, they're empirically equivalent, because the thing we're trying to explain, this is unique to all scientific issues. The phenomenon is unobservable.
Let me try to explain this way. So let's say, what is the best hypothesis of what caused a hurricane? Was it a cup or a magical leprechaun? Like, which would be a better explanation of the hurricane? A plastic cup or a magical leprechaun?
You know, these analogies are not as helpful as you seem to think they are. They're not really.
Try to answer, like it's a genuine question.
It's a stupid question. I mean, this is exposing that you don't really understand the subject at hand. Like, this is not analogous.
You haven't followed it through, so you have no idea. You just have to. So answer the question: which one is a better explanation of the hurricane? You have a hurricane. There's only two possibilities logically in this analogy. It was caused by a plastic cup or a magical leprechaun. Which one is the better explanation?
I'm not answering that. It's neither.
Well,
neither. In this analogy, it's
no. Wait, I think that okay. So they're gonna say this is just entirely irrelevant in this analogy, I guess. But the magical leprechaun would be a better explanation because there's a way that a magical leprechaun could explain a hurricane. There's no way that a cup can. Cups don't have the ability to. I mean, I guess maybe if you say the cup could also be magical, or maybe there's some natural explanation for it. I don't know. We would need more details about the scenario. I lean towards the leopard.
Not answering.
One of those two. It has to be one of these two.
I would think the cup. I mean, I get why you don't want to answer Emerson because it's like a setup analogy, but obviously one exists and one requires more.
Bingo.
It makes the answer harder to answer. That's how I would answer.
So how the fuck is that analogous to what we're talking about?
So the point here is that that was literally the follow-up to the analogy. So that was the next part that you explain after it. So the reason that the cup is a better explanation is that we have evidence it exists. Like, it's literally a thing in the world. Independent of imagination, leprechauns aren't. And the fact that we don't know anything about leprechauns, therefore they could explain a hurricane if they have magical powers, maybe, sure. That isn't evidence of anything. It's just a hypothesis you made up in your head. So the only thing that actually counts is something that you can show exists independent of your imagination in reality first, like the cup. And we can do that with matter. We can't do that with consciousness. It's like the analogy I used earlier in the beginning of.
Panpsychists think that matter exists. Okay, there's a mind,
and it's made of consciousness, which is wrong. So that's what I said at the beginning.
Tom, how do you know that I'm conscious?
With certainty, I don't.
Because I'm a bit of matter. I'm a bit of conscious matter.
Yes.
Okay, so we know here in this case that matter is conscious. That matter in some cases is consciousness. So how exactly do you go about verifying that?
I ask you questions to see if you can have an analogous experience to, or analogous responses to mine.
But you can't observe my experience, though, right? In the same
Indirect observation, I don't need to. So I don't need to. I don't need to observe the Big Bang to know the Big Bang is there. I don't need to observe your consciousness to know you're conscious.
Right, but you know that you're conscious, right?
Yep.
Okay, and I don't know that you're conscious. So again, there's just no way to verify this, and it's different from postulating.
I just need one.
It's different from postulating something that happened, or some natural phenomenon to explain some data that we can observe. Right now we're trying. Well, because in one case we postulate something in order to explain something that we can observe. It's an interpretation or an explanation.
It makes no difference. So that you haven't explained anything. So I say, if I want to know,
the thing I like best about you is that you're a great listener and you're very teachable.
Okay. So going back, that doesn't make a difference. You've explained no difference whatsoever. You don't understand epistemology. So if I say I want to know if something is conscious.
I thought that was a good line from Emerson. The thing I like best about you is that you're very teachable. You're a great listener.
Okay. There are two ways to do it: particularism and Methodism. Particularism, I can start with a particular thing and say anything that has the same qualities is conscious. Or Methodism, I can come up with a methodology to test if it has these properties and apply them.
TJump just splurges out philosophical words.
So I can say, given I'm conscious, I can start with this particular example, and then I can build a method around that particular thing and say, well, anything that has the same analogous properties is conscious. Does that give me certainty? Can I observe your consciousness directly? No. Do I need to? No. I can still know you're conscious because you passed the methodological test. I don't need to know with certainty to know. You don't need certainty for knowledge. So yes, I can know that you are conscious just by asking you questions and seeing if you are analogous to my consciousness. Just like I can know the Big Bang happened without actually observing the Big Bang. Those are exactly the same. It makes no difference which one, whether you postulate the theory to explain the data, or you make a theory, or that you see the data and make a theory to explain it. It makes no difference.
Okay, so just to come back to this point, I've had many conversations with many physicalists, and they don't make the same points that Tom is making. This is like, no one says this, no one thinks. No, I'm just letting listeners know that this is not the normal defense of physicalism or a good defense of physicalism.
No, it's a great defense. I just crushed you. So could you actually address what I said then? Like, if you think it's bad, address what I said.
I don't think you understand the view.
I don't care what you think. Address what I said. Like, if you can't address my argument, and you can't say, oh, well, you're ignorant of how to address my argument, therefore it fails. Like, no, I just crushed you, and you can't address it. So address it. If you can't address it, you lose.
I mean, you crushed me in the sense that a pigeon thinks it crushed someone when they're playing
so then
chess.
address what I said. Like, if you think it's wrong, address what I said.
I've tried a few different times. You keep interrupting me. You keep not listening. It's kind of frustrating.
Okay, then go. Address what I said. Go.
I mean, which part? I just there's nothing to grab onto.
Plenty of things for me to grab onto. So again, you keep making this argument that I can't know your conscious.
An argument. I haven't gotten to that point yet. you keep
Why are you interrupting? So you don't need a literal argument to be making an argument. So yeah, you are making an argument. You are saying that, I can't know you're conscious because I can't literally observe your consciousness, which no, I prove that false. I can know you're conscious just fine without observing your consciousness directly.
Okay, again, that was one step in a multi-step argument that I never got to the end of, and I'm frankly losing interest in getting to the end of the point. I mean, like.
Okay, so I proved that point wrong.
No, you didn't.
You said I couldn't know you're conscious, and I just
said
did.
Consciousness is not observable, and then you went off on and again, consciousness remains unobservable despite you crushing me.
Can I jump in?
I can know you're conscious without observing consciousness.
Let me jump in real quick just before we lose you guys, because I can see this is going downhill a little bit, but there's something that's been driving me crazy this whole conversation, and I feel like Emerson could prove his argument But I would think you would need to be able to show consciousness existing without a brain. Like just some evidence.
But the mod is also kind of dumb. No offense to the mod. I'm sure the mod's a lovely person, but the mod was sort of confused. Was like just spectacularly failing to track.
Of that, would you at least call that a fair requirement?
How would anyone show that consciousness exists anywhere because it's unobservable? Again, this is a unique
Indirect observation. I already answered that. Give novel testable predictions. Anything you want. Go.
Okay, but the thing is, you can't observe experience, so you can't actually verify that it's not over there or it is for sure over there. You can, again, okay, listen, you can make an inference. You can make I also believe that you're conscious, Tom, and I recognize that consciousness is unobservable. Okay, I'm inferring that you're conscious, and it's a good inference, but it doesn't change the basic fact that experience is unobservable, so I can't demonstrate that consciousness is somewhere over there, just like you can't demonstrate conclusively that I'm conscious. And again, like you said, you don't need certainty to like infer rationally that someone else is conscious.
But you don't need certainty to know. You don't need certainty to have knowledge.
Yes, agreed.
So it's not just to infer. It's like to have the conclusion. I know that you're conscious, and I know that you're made of matter. I don't need certainty for either of those things.
Right. So demonstrating that. So what Robert is saying is like I need to show that consciousness exists somewhere outside of a brain. And what I'm saying is I can't do that directly because it's not the same thing as observing like an atom or something.
Absolutely,
like that.
I totally get it. But you could do it indirectly.
So the thing that we have to do to get there is we have to reason our way there.
So you could do it indirectly, like all the things I mentioned, like it's how we do it indirectly for materialism. Those would work fine. But even if you couldn't do it indirectly, you would still need to provide some way that you can differentiate imagination from reality. Do you think these arguments can do that? That would be your
what I'm trying to impress upon you is that you have not met these ludicrous standards that you've set for me. You have not met them either.
So my standard is novel testable predictions. Has science made novel testable predictions? What?
Yes, you say that, but as I've explained, science and materialism are not the same things. We have different words for them because they're different ideas.
Are the scientists who are making predictions materialists and making predictions based off of materialism?
I don't care what their personal beliefs are. The point is, like, do the predictions.
That's what a prediction is. So you have a personal belief, you have a hypothesis, and then you make a prediction off of the hypothesis.
Hypotheses are not personal beliefs. And they're not testing materialism. They're testing specific, like, hypotheses that are consistent with both materialism, epiphenomenalism, forms of dualism, etc.
And then you confirm it. There are materialists who have a position, and then based off of that position, they make a hypothesis and a prediction.
Epiphenomenalism is a form of dualism.
Confirmed. That's literally what I'm asking for from you.
Okay, so again, the materialists that you're referring to were in a context where pretty much everyone was a dualist. So they thought, well, I don't think that we have this immaterial soul. So a consequence of that would be that if you change the brain, then you change the mind. Like dualists can't.
You said that I can't meet the standard that I'm holding you to. That's what you said, right?
Can I finish my fucking point, please?
No, because this was you said.
Can I finish my fucking point, please? No. TJump does these weird, like, bids for dominance. It's bizarre.
I cannot meet the standard that I asked of you.
So
and
sometimes,
I say, yes, I can.
Tom, chains of reasoning take longer than like 5 seconds. So I was going to come back around to that,
okay.
But please go ahead.
Yeah, because I was lost in what you were saying. I can't find the relevance there. So yes, I can. So
I understand that you can't find the relevance there. I'm very aware that you can't find the relevance there.
Yes, that's what I'm asking. So here's the question we're at. You said I can't meet my own standard. My standard is novel testable predictions. You can make hypothesis whatever you want. Any novel testable predictions you want. If they're confirmed, that's evidence. My standard, scientifically, materialism has met that. So I can meet my standard that I'm holding you to. Where's your objection?
Okay, so this chain of reasoning is going to take longer than 10 seconds. So just try to hang on. So the materialists that you're referring to, that apparently I'm not allowed to reference because they were materialists in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they were in a context of dualism. And they thought, well, I don't know if we have this immaterial soul. And a prediction of that view that the brain and the mind are the same thing, there's not this extra stuff, is that you change the brain and you change the mind. So that prediction is extremely borne out. It's very well supported that you change the brain and you change the mind. So you're right, those people were mostly materialists, but they were also mostly atomists. So the fact that, you change the brain, you change the mind is not really, good evidence for atomism. And it's not post-diction. If you go back and say, okay, I'm still a materialist, even though I'm not an atomist anymore. Now I believe in some kind of field ontology or something. But the point is you can still claim, that okay, the basic point is just that the brain is the mind. Okay, but even though the materialism of the 19th century is nothing like the materialism of the 21st century, literally nothing like it, that's fine. I'm not holding that against you. Okay, but the point is their hypothesis specifically, when you isolate it, is that the human brain and the human mind are the same thing. Okay, but there are many different versions of materialism that are compatible with that basic view, and the same goes for panpsychism. So just because the people who made the prediction were atomist materialists doesn't mean that you have to be an atomist materialist, or else you're guilty of post-diction or something like that. The point is that their specific hypothesis was not actually atomist materialism. It was the very specific claim that the brain and the mind are the same thing.
So I'm still not. Yeah, I was right. Where none of that actually answered my question. So
it does answer your question.
No, my question was you said that I can't meet my standard to which I'm holding you to. My standard is novel testable predictions.
You're guilty of post-diction.
So your wave is not in any way post-diction. That's what happened was they made new novel testable predictions for waves that defeated atoms, and so those new novel testable predictions confirmed this new hypothesis. So if you have new novel testable predictions that would confirm idealism or panpsychism, that'd be great. That's great evidence. It would be for wave theory. So I'm not post-dicting theory. I'm adopting the new novel testable predictions because those work.
You don't believe in the same theory of mind, the same metaphysics as the people who made those novel testable predictions way back when.
Right. I believe in the ones that have made the new novel testable predictions.
It's the same thing. It's just the brain is the mind. I mean, like, it's the same, like, the basic, and again, one of the leading neuroscientific theories, which is integrated information theory, implies panpsychism. There's some novel...
It's not one of the leading ones, but...
yeah, it is. And plus, it leads to novel testable predictions.
Yeah, what are those? What are those? What?
Integrated information theory.
No, I know what it is. Giulio Ciannone is the guy who wrote it. What testable prediction does it make?
I mean, like, integrated information theory does make novel testable predictions. It makes predictions about... It makes predictions about, for instance, like people who are in comas. Like we could try to figure out whether or not they're conscious, and when they come out of the coma, we can see if they were in fact conscious based on the criteria that Ciannone has developed. It is testable, and I mean,
cool. That would be great evidence if that's confirmed. Sure.
Okay, so in your mind, IIT like doesn't make novel testable predictions, or are you just?
No, I was literally just asking. I don't know. I haven't studied it.
How would you guys feel about doing a final wrap up because we're coming up with that 1 hour mark?
I gotta go.
Okay.
I don't need to make a closing statement. This has just been a fucking dumpster fire. I mean, I'll just say, like, again, there are better defenses of physicalism out there for anyone listening. Like, this is not a good defense of physicalism. Never play chess with a pigeon. Goodbye.
Wow, that was dumb.
Okay. Hey, thanks, man.
Yep, no problem.
Let's play the closing. Okay, what's that actually? Well, so yeah, no, it's really funny that TJump is like writing a book about epistemology. I mean, that is going to be the dumpster fire. Yeah, I had thought that his book was out, and I searched for it for a while because I wanted to write a blog post destroying TJump's terrible epistemology. But alas, I wasn't able to. So, if you think that TJump's arguments are ludicrous, then donate over at my Patreon if you want to see. If you want to financially contribute to me debating TJump, then go over to the Patreon and donate. Okay. Yeah, I don't have that much more to say. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been a survey of TJump's deeply confused views about epistemology and metaphysics. Yeah. All right. Peace out. Thanks for watching, everyone.